We're here live on the podcast here, and I have a highly regarded guest today. This is Andrew Huberman, everyone. As far as, I don't know, like an intersection of high level credentials in a educational aspect and a real like clinical setting aspect, plus being like borderline like a social media celebrity at this point, I would say too. I'm very, very grateful to have you on the show here and, discuss some of the stuff you've discussed on your channel and your podcast and whatnot. Also highly recommend you guys check out his podcast. If you haven't, I learned a lot from it all the time, and highly entertaining as well. Just give me like a quick high level, summarization. Like, I know you probably have to do this on every podcast you go on, but I mean, just like who you are, sort of your background, how you got into transitioning from, the academic side of things into like being a hybrid sort of presenter of information in a, a mass scale format on social media as well. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks for the kind introduction. I have seen your content, and you and I have gotten to know each other a little bit, and the incredible loyalty of your following, and which is growing all the time, and the depth and rigor to which you dissect out health information for people and provide damage control for also the extent to which you clarify information that's out there is really terrific. And so I know I speak for many people when I say thank you. It's no surprise that your following is so loyal and to the point where if I say something that could even be perceived even slightly as a contradiction of something you said, people definitely want to see us go louder.
Yeah.
But I'll just say this for the record, Derek and I chat, and I think we agree on more things than we disagree on.
100%.
Yeah. So, but in any case, I appreciate you having me here. So, the short version of my trajectory is, so as an undergraduate, I worked in a laboratory that could be called they worked on thermal regulation. I was really interested in how the brain and the body communicate through the nervous system and through hormones to regulate body temperature. And this was in the early 90s. And I actually did a study looking at a number of different compounds, including things like clenbuterol, things like MDMA, things
DNP?
Like, what's that?
Have you ever looked at DNP?
Dinitrophenol.
I know Sinclair has actually mentioned uncouplers for potential anti-aging properties, which I thought was interesting. The intersection with like the most dangerous fat burner in the bodybuilding community being talked about from the like premier longevity anti-aging guy on social media.
Yeah. Well, I feel an obligation here to say that I highly, highly recommend against exploration of dinitrophenol. I mean, a number of people have died, and it is no joke. But yeah, at the time I was running studies looking at how these drugs impact perception of body temperature at the level of the brain and the body. Now, this was in laboratory animals. And I did my undergraduate degree in what at the time was called biopsychology, eventually was named neuroscience, but it was really physiology. And there was some focus on hormones as well. And we studied a number of things like motivated behaviors, but also thermal regulation was the main focus. Then I collected my undergraduate degree, and then my master's degree, I was studying circadian rhythms, the role of melatonin in sleep-wake cycles, and seasonal changes in melatonin. And I also had a project related to how androgens impact prenatal development and how it impacts digit ratios in humans. This is a study that was published in Nature in the year 2000 and has been now replicated no fewer than 5 times, looking at how the ratio of the index finger to the ring finger on the right hand, it's a testosterone exposure during prenatal development tends to make this finger slightly shorter than this finger. In females, they're more similar, but you have to measure.
What's this look like to you? Does it look?
Well, so here's the challenge before people start doing this. You have to actually caliper from the crook to here. Okay. It kind of depends on the shape of the palm. So yeah, so like if I were to do, we're doing, this is not precise science, but I'm holding a pen now here. You can't really see where I'm calipering. Yeah, so your digit, your pointer finger is shorter than your ring finger. And it's a small difference, but in females, they are more statistically, they're more similar than they are in males. Now, there's some really interesting things there. We could go down that rabbit hole that actually have semblance to, or have statistical correlations that are strong as they relate to sexual orientation, for instance. But this difference is most pronounced on the right hand of heterosexual males and heterosexual females. Small
we
difference.
Definitely got to talk about that. We should.
Yeah,
I didn't write that on my topics list, but that's highly interesting.
Sure. Yeah, we could do, and I'd be happy to talk about that at any point. There are a number of so-called prenatal androgenic organizing effects, and that was just one. There's a guy actually at University of Texas, Austin, Dennis McFadden, who discovered that there's also an early androgen exposure that impacts what are called autoacoustic emissions, which are some people, their ears actually make sounds, and that's dependent on androgen exposure in utero. So basically, long story short, my master's was spent studying melatonin, circadian rhythms, and sleep, but also how androgens impact brain development and body phenotype development. And I've long been interested in that topic because we often hear about the effects of hormones after one is born, but there are these early organizing effects that predict how one will react to hormones, endogenous or exogenous hormones, after you're born. And this is really, it's a whole world into itself. And then I went off and did a PhD in neuroplasticity and how the brain can change in response to experience, mainly through what they call activity dependent mechanisms. So not so much molecular pathways, but more how behaviors can change the way our nervous system is structured. And then I'm trying to do this quickly because it's a long arc, but just to give you a sort of sense of the palette of things, because I have enjoyed working on a number of topics. And then I did what's called a postdoc, which is sort of like a residency. And then I worked on genetics of cell types in the eye and visual circuitry and how we see and perceive the visual world. And then when I started my own lab as an assistant professor, assistant means you're not an assistant to anyone. What it means is that you don't have tenure yet. So your first 5 or 6 years, you are an assistant professor, although running your own lab. And I was working on neural regeneration, something my lab still works on after injury, mainly in the visual system. And then we started working on stress and stress modulation. And then when I got tenure, moved to Stanford, which is where I'd done some of my earlier training. My lab started working almost entirely on humans. We still do some work on mice, but we started doing some work on humans. And during that time, I also started doing some work on stress, sleep, neuroplasticity, and so forth with various members of special operations, certain units on the state side, also some units up in Canada. These are unnamed units that do important work all over the world. They know who they are. They're really wonderful people. And they basically brought me on to put a neuroscience perspective on some of the challenges that they were facing: stress, recovery, high performance. They're in these very complicated rhythms of work. And there I also started talking to people about what people were doing in terms of their hormone system or their supplementation or their nutrition. You know, if you hang around high performance communities long enough, whether or not it's professional athletes or military or otherwise, people start asking questions like, is keto better than a high carbohydrate diet? People start asking, what are your thoughts on androgens? What are your thoughts on TRT? Why are we seeing guys who are such high performers who come in and can crush everything, and then they're exiting their careers with low testosterone? Why is that? They don't look like they have low testosterone. So what's going on? And so I've developed a bit of a role in consulting and helping, oftentimes as a referral service. So I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a scientist, so I don't prescribe anything. I profess things, but I often have people in my community that I can connect people to who have answers if I don't have them. And so that's really the arc of it. And then how did the media side can be summarized very quickly. In 2019, I lost a bet to a friend, and I agreed to do 60 seconds of Instagram posts teaching social media every day. Actually, a former SEAL team guy, he said, what would you want to do this next year? And I said, it would be kind of fun to teach science. So we shook on it. I didn't really lose, but I did that. And there I was, very robotically delivering little information about the retina or something like that. And people seemed to like it. And then during 2020, when everything got crazy, I decided, look, I'm not going to talk about anything that's going on in terms of the global events, but I am going to start sharing tools related to stress from my laboratory and these projects that we're doing with psychiatry at Stanford, tools that I've seen have major impact on high performers in terms of mitigating stress, improving sleep, et cetera. And by the end of 2020, I'd gone on a number of podcasts, and my good friend Lex Friedman, who has the Lex Friedman podcast, many people are familiar with him, suggested that I start my own podcast. So in January of 2021, I started the Huberman Lab podcast. And that's when I decided I didn't just want to talk about my work. And in fact, I really enjoy reading about, researching, and talking about other related fields within neuroscience and physiology, biology, psychology. And my format for that is always the same. I reach out to people who I know to be really world expert in those areas. I talk to them. I read textbooks, like I'm big on textbooks. And then I scour the literature, and then I try and think about science and tools that people could use. And then I will host guests from time to time, but that's really my process. And these are much like university lectures, but with a lot of practical tools woven in. And I should say, Derek, I've also learned quite a bit from your podcast. I mean, you're, again, not just saying this because we're sitting here face to face, but your willingness to dive deep into the literature and excavate the gems for people is an extremely valuable skill and resource. So, and I've relied on that resource myself.
Oh, that's awesome. That's flattering to know that you watch my stuff and learn from it too. So, like,
yeah, I confess, once or twice I saw a home gynecomastia removal thing. I might have paused that.
Yeah.
That was almost too much.
Yeah.
But I know that you cover a range of content, and there's some really impressive coverage of scientific.
It's like, how do I find ways to make it as mainstream gen pop appealing as possible while still integrating information? And it's just like, guy gets his tit cut open, like boom, goes viral, versus just talking about the science of like estrogen receptors and whatnot. So trying to do my best of intertwining the education with the entertainment side of things. But yeah, well,
clearly it's working. And I actually don't know your background, and I should, and I apologize, but what you're delivering is really great. And I understand that balance. I experienced that challenge in trying to give people information and tools. Some people I would say there are kind of 5 categories of health tool seekers out there. One is
tell me the results of that poll, by the way. I saw you put it up. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll tell you. I think that, so here's an idea. Maybe everyone could just ask themselves this. The lower your score tells you something, the higher your score, it tells you something. You can pick more than one category, but you get a score of 1, not necessarily better or worse, but you get a score of 1 if you're the kind of person that says, tell me the data, but only from humans. Okay. Then there's another category of people, I would say category 2, which is tell me the data, mice are fine, right? The third category would be just tell me what you do, tell me what you take, right? Yeah. And then category 4 would be just tell me what to take. Just tell me what to do. People are like, tell me what to do. I don't care about the science. Just tell me what to do. That's what a lot of people say. And then there's category 5, which is, please tell me that what I'm already doing and I have no intention of changing is safe. They just want the validation that they're not going to harm themselves. And of course, which category you subscribe to will vary depending on whether or not it's a workout in the gym or some vial of some substance that comes from some unknown source, right?
Yeah.
But I think that we are at a time now where people want health information. Yeah. They want to guide their own seeking of health information. And the challenge in doing the sort of things that you and I do is that you're dealing with all 5 and every combination of those 5. So the answer to your question, what was the results of the poll, where some people were like saying I'm a 1, and other people were like I'm a 2, and then other people were like I'm a 4, 3, 1, depending on whether or not it's Tuesday, Wednesday, or leap year. It was like all over the place. And it just told me that the key is to make very clear what the source is, so that then people can filter that information for themselves. And there's one other category, of course, which is self-experimentation. In science, there used to be a rich history of scientists, laboratory scientists, doing self-experimentation. That's no longer allowed or in vogue. But I should mention that, over the years, my main 2 I was involved in a number of sports growing up, but I wasn't a very, successful athlete. I wasn't unsuccessful, but I've been weight training since I was about 16 years old. I'm now 46. My first entrance to weight training, actually, Mike Mentzer was the guy who handed me a training protocol.
Wow.
I got to know him through a personal connect, and he also handed me a bunch of philosophy books, which was
What was his like persona like? Because it's kind of interesting because he's prominently known as I'm sure you're aware of nandrolone, the anabolic steroid. He's known as a guy who popularly took nandrolone only cycles without a base of testosterone. So he was like what many assume. I think a lot of people don't dig this far, but they see that he was sort of a bit mentally unstable and seemed like odd to the average person. I don't know if that's actually the case, which I'll kind of get into that in a sec, but the sort of idea behind the nandrolone exposure causing these kind of cognitive abnormalities and people ending up kind of wonky is estrogen deprivation. And I don't know if that has any sort of impact on the way he acted and what you sort of saw reflected from the way he, his character and whatnot. Did you see any kind of wonkiness with him that would be, I don't know.
Yeah. So we were introduced through a friend. And, I have to say, Mike was very helpful to me. So he said a couple of things. First of all, he discouraged me from going near any anabolics. He was really adamant about that. He said, look, you're not going to have a career in this. You're doing this for your own fitness and well-being. I highly encourage you to just really learn how to train well. I thought that was great advice, and the second thing was he really encouraged me to pursue my academic studies. And, he really believed in reading and learning. He wasn't crazy about scientific credentials. He wasn't, but he was a big fan of reading and researching and learning from the existing literature. So there was a little bit of a contradiction there. Basically, when Mike spoke to you, whether by phone or in person, he barked at you. He just barked at you. And I'm saying it that way because his voice was always he'd say, Andrew, if you're gonna train, he was just really, really, he was super intense. Yeah. And there were rumors that, that maybe he had some struggles with, the dieting that those guys
substance abuse too, I think. So maybe that was probably more to do with it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm a big fan of, there's a wonderful writer named Oliver Sacks who wrote The Man Who Mistook His Wife for His Hat, etc. He was a neurologist and popular book writer. But Oliver lived in Venice and held the California state squat record. He was a serious academic and he hung around a lot of bodybuilders. He was friends with Mike and those guys. There was a lot of amphetamine use back then. Dieting and training. And Mike, the rumors were that he might have been involved in that, but I don't know. He had great advice as far as sleep. He really encouraged me to get good at sleeping. So whatever he did in his own life, I don't know. I wouldn't, there's no reason for me to know, but the advice that he gave me as a young man in terms of somebody exploring training and pursuing school was really terrific advice, frankly. I think I owe him a debt of gratitude, and I still have my notebooks from back then. He had me on these crazy training sessions where I would train and then I wouldn't train for 4 days and then I'd train again. And I hated it because training is so much fun. Yeah. I know some people don't enjoy training, but I loved it. So eventually I transitioned to something that was a little bit more regular, but weight training and running have always been my two forms of exercise. And those are the ones I still basically do, 4 or 5 times a week in total to this day, 30 years.
Okay. So some of those subtopics are highly niched and specific that you were digging into in your research, throughout your progress as a professional. How do you even decide on that stuff? Is it just this is the most highly interesting topic to me? Or is it the overarching educational authority that you're underneath sort of dictates what you dig into? Because some of that stuff is so niched out, right?
You're talking about when one is selecting a research project?
Yeah. So if you're researching prenatal exposure to androgens and how it's going to dictate, neurology or how you even sexual behavior as you grow up, stuff like that. How do you even stumble into such a specific thing? I feel is what I'm wondering.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's a really great question. So a lot of it has to do with your local environment. As a master's student, I was in a department at UC Berkeley that was well known for many decades for the study of hormones and behavior. A guy named Frank Beach had founded the department and had studied the effects of early castration, testosterone supplementation in females, estrogen supplementation in males, pregnant females, studied hunger, sex behavior. And so it was just all around me. So when I arrived, I was very interested in how melatonin, this hormone from the pineal, interacts with the reproductive system. And so you just sort of pick something and you go down that rabbit hole. And then when I went off to the next stage, I was surrounded by people that were particularly talented at something else. So I've often looked at what my local environment was very good to exceptional for. And that's where I felt I could learn the most. Now, of course, all along, I've tried to focus on things that really excited me and that I was interested in, because one of the key things about scientific research in a laboratory or for a degree that's so different than scouring for information on the internet is that when you do a scientific study or you do a degree at any level, there are two requirements. One is that you learn a tremendous amount about the thing that you're researching, but that you also are required, in order to get your degree, to place that into a larger context. So for instance, it's not sufficient to go and learn how to do experiments and collect data, do statistics, write up a paper and get it published. That's what technicians do. The difference between a technician and somebody that then gets a degree or an advanced degree in a topic is that you have to be able to write a discussion, give a talk that places it into a broader context for an audience of people that know nothing about that topic. And so now you've done a very good job of learning how to connect the dots in this way, right? So much so that I assumed that you have formal credentials. I don't know if you do or not, doesn't matter. But the point is that, we don't even know your last name, Derek. Nobody knows your last name.
Yeah,
Guess what, folks?
That's true.
Guess what? Yeah, that's right. So very smart move on your part, by the way. But being able to place something into context is really important. And I think the best online educational materials come from people who are able to do that, because otherwise anyone can look at an abstract or a study, find a data point and say, see, statistically significant, this, no, but it's the whole backdrop of all that knowledge that you have stored in your mind. And the people that who are of varying quality in terms of their ability to discern data. So many times, for instance, I'll see a result, I'll think about it, and then I'll go and ask somebody, is it weird that this doesn't seem right? And you'll learn a lot that way. So I think you can't consider anything in a vacuum. But in graduate school, you are very nose down. You've really got the blinders on. I can't say that you really learn how to do that until you've been giving a lot of public discourse. I think the comment section for your channel, for instance, a lot of the comments are going to be yes, great, or no, I disagree. Mostly yes, great. But the comments that come back that say, hey, but what about blank? Those are wonderful educational tools for feedback, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I've had some of the most insightful stuff I've found, or even people I've hired are random commenters or people who randomly sent something in. It's funny because even our medical director for Marek, that's how we met. He was just made a comment about a video I did on a guy who basically hadn't gone through puberty, and he was like 27 years old or something. And he was giving me his stance on hyperprolactinemia and kind of like the interactions with the HPTA and what may, have caused this guy's issues. And I was like, wow, like that was extremely insightful. Like, you looking for some work on the side, or what's going on? What are you doing with your life right now? Yeah. So just that kind of stuff you find like very, you learn as you're going, even if you're presenting the information, and you find like a lot of high quality feedback for sure.
Yeah. I'm happy to say that, I'm quite open-minded, meaning, like, for instance, we got to know each other because I believe I knew about your channel, but I think after I went on Rogan and I called it Turkesterone, and I got attacked by your community.
The first thing was your testosterone makes effort feel good. I think a lot of people really identified with that clip from Lex's podcast, and I did like a reaction to that, and I kind of just like talked about the stress resilience aspect and the kind of interactions with the neurological side of things. That was where I saw your stuff for the first time, and I was like, how have I not stumbled across, like, it's like so overlapping with my interests. And then you made a comment like, I appreciate the clip and blah, blah, blah. And then after that, when you went on Rogan, that's when you like really dived into stuff that was like right up my alley. And I was like, ooh, like this is a good one for sure.
Yeah. And no, it's been great to get to be chatting back and forth a lot lately, because after that, of course, yes, I think we both agree now, for the record, it's neither Turkesterone nor Turkesterone. There is no official pronunciation.
I guess technically there might be, but I mean, like, I'd have to talk to somebody who wrote the original literature on it, and maybe they don't even know. Who knows?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that the online community of people seeking health information tend to latch on to those details. What I like is what I like is how you have a more macroscopic view, and you're thinking, and I'm sure that I misspeak from time to time. I'm a human being, and the fun is learning from one another, and certainly that's been happening. I mean, I think there's so much interest now in things that relate to hormones and hormone augmentation, optimization, and I'd be remiss if I didn't give a nod to your colleague, Dr. Kyle Gillette, who, and I should be very clear. I think that I should have said this earlier. Derek and I have no current business arrangement. It's not to say that we wouldn't be collaborators in the future along those lines, but like I'm mentioning Kyle because I heard him on Mark Bell's podcast, and I was like, wow, this person who's an MD, a medical doctor, knows so much about the endocrine system and is so balanced in his description of it. He was talking about polycystic ovarian syndromes in women. He was talking about TRT in men, age-related differences, considerations. And I just thought, wow, whoever this person is, I want to hear more from him, because it's very balanced, very rational, and very thoughtful about different people's goals and situations. And that is a rare phenotype in the online health community. And I thought, wow, this is the kind of person I'd want to have as my physician.
Yeah. That's like, when I say Marek is turnkey, like that's the best way I can summarize it in terms of our balanced approach to hormone management. And just, it's not like so many of these clinics, like, frankly, are just testosterone mills, or like ways to circumvent the system to prescribe legal tests and kind of like get bodybuilders the stuff they would have bought on the underground anyways at like a prescription level. But like we're truly like passionate about preventative medicine and helping people identify like unique endocrine disorders and whatnot. Like, we've diagnosed underlying pituitary adenomas, like so many things that people have been told by random urologists, endocrinologists, not saying they're all, obviously they're very good at what they do, but oftentimes you'll get overlooked because you're a young guy with an issue, or there's no way you could have a testosterone problem. You're 22 years old when in reality you have a tiny fucking tumor on your pituitary gland or something. Like, that kind of stuff is stuff we've been able to parse out. And it's like, I'm very happy to be able to bring stuff like that to the forefront, because how many times have I gone to a doctor just like begging for like a lipid profile or something basic, and I've been, shunned because I look like I don't know, I work out, so therefore I probably take some shit, and therefore I'm probably an irresponsible guy. Or even just being young in general, they don't want you to even get access to blood work in Canada. Like, it's kind of wild. So being able to bring that stuff is like highly motivating and a huge passion of mine, as well as Kyle's, obviously.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of data. I would say that the number one advice that I could give anyone of any age, teenager onward, is get blood work done from a reputable source. Because if you have those as baselines, then later, if you run into an issue, you have something to compare to. Now, of course, the variable of time is also changing. So it's not a perfect experiment, but in some sense, it's the best experiment you could ever do, because at least you're not comparing yourself to, for instance, if you feel great at a particular age and your numbers are of a particular value, and then 3 years later you go and your numbers are different and you don't feel good. That's very different than just getting a snapshot of a given number. You don't know what to compare to except the reference range, which is enormous and is highly individual. So the reference range that you want is your own reference range. And I think that And this is what, in science, statistics are always strongest for within subject control, as opposed to, so if you compare my hormone profile and your hormone profile, it's gonna be very different, but also we are different ages, we live different lifestyles, all sorts of things. But if I'm comparing to myself, then at least the variables that have changed, age, location, et cetera, at least I'm aware of it, all of the major variable changes, what I was eating then, what I was eating now. So you can bootstrap, as they call it in statistics, you can bootstrap and say, I have a feeling it's related to blank. And you can't, there's no time machine. So I can't go back and get the numbers that I wish I had when I was 25. I can only compare to when I started getting regular blood work. So I would say that is definitely worth the cost. It can save you hundreds of thousands of dollars across a lifetime, really. I truly believe that.
Yeah. If you're familiar with WADA's biological passport they use in athletes, it's like a way they track. It's like, so when they take their blood as well as their urine, like urine is typically analyzed just for synthetic metabolites of certain anabolic androgenic steroids, stimulants, rec drugs, etc. But the blood itself, they assess longitudinal data of their hematology profile to assess any aberrations in hematocrit, hemoglobin, etc., to assess for blood doping, EPO usage, etc. But that kind of thing, like they create such like a minute little reference range for the individual based on that longitudinal data that they can tell when there's any sort of aberration that's even like 1/10 of what is a traditional reference range, that something is off with the individual that then, warrant a red flag for further exploration, which obviously in their context is more drug testing. But in like extrapolating that for the layman who's trying to assess their health biomarkers long term, I think creating your own like sort of makeshift biological passport with like continuous blood work markers, eventually you can narrow down like your personal reference range to something that's so like minute and specific that when you have like a significant aberration and something that is presenting as like actual, I don't know, like representative of actual symptoms or something, you can go back and see, like, look at this narrow range I've been functioning through for my entirety of my life. And then all of a sudden, I don't know, my whatever is like way out of whack and relative to this. Like you would not be able to do that otherwise. So kind of just like riffing off what you said, like I think it's highly, not just for guys on gear. Like everyone thinks only guys on gear should be, the ones getting blood work. If I'm in my 20s, like why the hell would I ever need something? It's like, well, like if you end up hypogonadal in your mid 30s or whatever, or you end up with some sort of major problematic episode of fill in the blank, like it's just nice to be able to look back and see those snapshots in time ultimately yield a longitudinal profile that is representative of actual like real metrics that you can use as understanding like what went wrong and why perhaps. So that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah. And you can also learn a lot, just like you said, even for people that aren't hormone assisted in any way. So for instance, a few years ago, I learned by tracking my blood work that when my schedule is more demanding and I was under more so-called stress, my free testosterone levels would go up. And I thought, well, this doesn't make any sense, right? This makes no sense whatsoever, right? Everything you know about sex hormone binding globulin and cortisol, the testosterone ratios. Well, I got to talking with Duncan French, who's head of the UFC Performance Center. He has a PhD in exercise physiology. He runs that center. It is an amazing place. And he said, there are a subset of individuals who their testosterone release is tethered to adrenaline release in a very interesting way. He told me about a study that he had done or had been involved in years ago of looking at skydivers who were excited about skydiving versus stressed about skydiving, and testosterone increases. And, we pieced together a story, and it's a just so story. But during times of more relaxed times when I'm not working quite as intensely, I actually feel a little bit of a dip. I feel a little bit low. And so I don't get depressed. My testosterone doesn't plummet or anything like that. But turns out some people are, their androgens come through a general activation of challenge. And so this is the reciprocity, as we say, between behaviors can trigger androgen release, and androgen release can also feed back on behavior. And you can make up a just so story where it makes sense, where if you need to lean into challenge, the body would start to deploy things, at least in the short term, that would allow you to lean into that challenge. So, and that's where I discovered the literature, which is a quite beautiful literature, really, from a guy named Mark Breedlove at Michigan State, but some others as well, that led to this statement that testosterone makes effort feel good, because what it does is it changes the firing of neurons in the amygdala. and causes the neurons in the amygdala, which most people think are just associated with fear, but are also associated with challenges of any kind. It gates them in a positive way. It links it to the dopamine system in a way, because the dopamine circuits, these things have names, nucleus accumbens, VTA, they connect to the amygdala, and it starts ramping up those circuits so that challenge and leaning into challenge becomes a source of dopamine reward. And actually, I have a new finding to report to you. It's not from my lab, but there's a guy up at the University of Washington studying this in animals and in humans. And there's a subset of individuals who get dopamine release and testosterone release from aggression. Fighting is rewarding for a subset of individuals. And you think, well, of course, some people like to fight and other people don't. Other people don't, excuse me. So so I learned a lot from my blood work. And so I maintain a pretty intense schedule. I'll take a day off every once in a while, but I'm not somebody who does well if I'm just completely relaxing all the time. And I think this, earlier we were talking about sleep and, how much sleep and what sort of schedule to run when you're really leaning into effort. And, you asked at the times when I was most productive, what was my sleep schedule like? And, in graduate school, my sleep schedule was crazy. I would sleep until, 10 or 11 a.m. I'd get up, I'd kind of go coffee, drink some water, maybe go to the gym, maybe not, maybe wait till the afternoon to do that, get into work. I was up until 2 or 3 a.m. working in the lab, blasting music. I was in my 20s. Yeah. Now my schedule is much more to bed by 10:30 or 11, up by, 6 a.m. or so. And I must say that at every stage, however, it's always been slight sleep deprivation for me, not hours and hours, and occasionally I'll sleep in, but I think in general, I do well in a kind of, I always say you can either be back on your heels, which is not good. You can either be flat-footed or you can be forward center of mass. And I generally feel good when I'm a little bit more forward center of mass, feeling a little bit strained and as if I'm reaching for a little bit more than I can do. That's just how my system reacts well. And my hormone profiles reflect that. Some people are not like that. My friend Ben Pakulski, who's a pretty accomplished former Olympian bodybuilder, he says that, the best bodybuilders are ultra parasympathetic. All they train that short period of time, and then all they do is like eat and sleep. And, he was joking about that, but, so I think that there's a range there, and people with that blood work, you can figure out kind of how you work best and what activates you in a positive way.
So there's a lot to unpack there that I want to dig into too. So you mentioned your sleep schedule, and like now your dialed in sleep schedule is 10:30 to 11, wake up at 6. Is that representative of what you like? That's a good day for you in terms of like, you're happy with a like 7 hour to 7.5 hour, like total time in bed. And that equates to, do you use any like tracking devices like an Oura Ring or a Whoop or anything? You just go by the general biofeedback, how you feel sort of thing?
Yes. Okay. So, well, obviously sleep is so vitally important. And so much of my online time is spent telling people how to get better at sleeping. So sleep is wonderful in the recovery sense. In the early part of the sleep, your first half of sleep is going to be mainly focused on physical recovery, but mentally, you just can't perform if you're not getting enough of that REM sleep, which comes later in the night for everybody and more toward morning or later in your sleep cycle. Cause I know your sleep cycle is a little bit shifted. Yeah. Derek, last name not to be named, is mostly nocturnal, folks. So at least for now, but it obviously is working for you.
That's one of my main goals, is to fix that. Yeah.
Oh, we can fix that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's more a matter of, I don't know, just like something about the daytime, and when it's bright outside, I feel like, I don't know, life is going on, and when you're so sedentary on a computer, for example, for your work, it's very difficult for me to focus when life is going on around me. So usually I excel the best when it's dark and I know people are asleep and my phone's not ringing off the hook, and, there's no emails coming in. I can really just like get my head down, get stuff done. But it's obviously problematic in maintaining a ideal circadian rhythm where I am pretty much the opposite of what is ideal, frankly. Like, it's like literally the opposite side of like what I should be doing. And at the few and far between times I have maintained like a 10 to 6 schedule. It's interesting because I I don't necessarily entirely trust the metrics on the Oura rings or stuff like that. Like I don't, believe they're entirely accurate. However, I do notice my sleep efficiency is superior whenever I've gone to bed at, 10 p.m. versus 4 or 5 a.m., even if it's the same total time in bed and I'm just as tired. It's definitely easier to kind of like max out your REM and deep sleep components. And just in general, the quality seems to be better, but I don't know if that's a result of, like, hypothetically, I could pull like a Ben Greenfield, I feel like, and like biohack my environment and put like all these like lights in my face and shit and like try and like fake that I'm on the proper rhythm. But I think ideally, like, I assume this is actually one of my questions, but I feel like I already know the answer, is the difference between like somebody who works shift work and is forced to follow a subpar circadian rhythm, but otherwise still gets their 8 hours in. Like the quality of that relative to somebody like yourself who's in bed at like 10:30 until 6, like does the literature reinforce that that's like, even if you're in bed for 8 hours, it's impossible to replicate the same quality?
Okay, so great question. First of all, it varies by age. So when you're younger, shift work has less of a detrimental impact than it does when you're older. And this is because of some changes in the way that the pineal churns out melatonin, but also some other things that change as we age, like the lymphatic clearance which is like a washout system of the brain, but that occurs during sleep. But, I think we could probably nail this with a couple key findings. So first of all, if you are going to be on any sleep schedule, ideally you maintain that schedule for at least 2 weeks. So the worst thing possibly in the world is the swing shift schedule, where you're sleeping from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. like a typical person for 3 days, and then you're switching to sleeping all day and up all night, and then back again, switching back and forth. That's
so I guess shift work would be like where your shifts change, or is it like that's actually what that is?
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I should have been more clear.
No, I should have been more clear. My bad question.
So I think the best way that we could probably frame this for your audience would be, typical schedule would be going to sleep somewhere between 9:30 and 11:30, and waking up somewhere between 5:30 and 8 a.m. Right? Mm-hmm. That's sort of typical schedule. And then the inverted schedule, or the let's call it the atypical schedule, would be going to bed very late, waking up in the mid morning or early afternoon, and then and so on. Swing shift is when people are switching between the typical and the atypical schedule.
Yeah.
More often than every 2 weeks. And that causes not just disruption of the gut clock and liver clock and the circadian mechanisms that lead to indigestion and heart issues. It actually leads to such chronic increases in cortisol and such altered patterns of dopamine that in the brain that you can get mild psychosis in people that would otherwise be perfectly fine. You can exacerbate psychosis and depression in people that have a predisposition for them. You can see learning deficits. It's just really bad to do that swing shift. Now, if you are on a schedule of the sort that you described, like going to bed, I'm guessing around 3 a.m. and sleeping until you're
right now, it's really bad, dude. It's like 5 a.m. to like 1, ish.
But as long as you're getting that sleep and you're consistent about that schedule, it's probably, I would say it's not a problem until it is, right? So for you, I mean, you're still training, you still get your blood work done. You still maintain a healthy social life. You are involved, you do the supercar thing. Like you've got things going on as far as I can tell, and you're very successful. So, I mean, I had a schedule that wasn't quite that extreme, but was similar to that for many years. Lex Friedman follows a schedule of staying up late often and sleeping in late and waking up. Sometimes he'll switch, but it sort of depends. So I think there's a time for it when it's fine. I think that in the long term, it's best to get to a more regular schedule, but some people are indeed night owls and prefer to go to bed late and wake up late. Some people do really well getting up early and going to bed at like 8:39, which sounds dreadful to me. It just sounds like the worst schedule because I like mornings and evenings. The one thing that is really valuable is that if people are feeling tired when they would like to be awake, then they need to change their sleep schedule. So I think that's the number one thing. And the true definition of insomnia is not that you can't sleep. It's that you're falling asleep during the day or during the time when you would like to be alert because you're exhausted. And so at the sleep clinic at Stanford, they define insomnia by a number of metrics, but that's the primary one. And then, of course, I can mention a tool that's kind of useful. That the psychiatry department at Stanford, we have a guy, our associate chair, developed this Reverie app, Reveri. It's a hypnosis app, free app for Android and Apple phone that has self-hypnosis scripts for focus, for sleep, for pain management. These are clinically tested. They're actually quite good. They're short scripts. And, for people that just can't sleep because of anxiety, I do think there are great things to take, but I think that are outside the prescription drug realm, as you, of course, know, and I know your company. Your company now has a new name. Is that right?
No, it's a sister company. Yeah. So it's going to be producing more like niched, different array of products, but it's for all intents and purposes, it is like Gorilla Mind still. It's just like a sister brand of the company.
Got it. Yeah. Got it. So, your sleep formulation, I've talked about some sleep formulations of that, magnesium, apigenin related things. The similar things are in your, I just got some of yours, so I'll try yours soon. So, but in addition to that, I think people who can't sleep because they have a lot of anxiety can use something like Reverie, which will allow them to calm down and fall asleep more easily. And you use this away from sleep. You're training your brain to relax and to turn off thinking, which is kind of hard to do just by snapping your finger. Yeah. So it's a good resource. And the data say that the speed to enter sleep and the and the duration and quality of sleep is quite good for people that use that every once in a while as a training tool. And then you asked about sleep monitors. So Whoop and Aura. Whoop has support some of the work in my lab, so I want to be clear about that. I personally don't wear a Whoop, so sorry, folks at Whoop. I just can tell when I'm waking up rested or not, and if I'm not rested, I tend to stay in bed. And
I think some people, they look too much at the minutia rather than like basic feedback of your body. They'll spend all this time on like all these crazy devices and biohacking tools, and they'll miss like basic shit, like just get to bed at a reasonable time, try to avoid blue light, sleep for 8 hours. If you feel good, it's probably working. And they'll like get into like, I have to have my grounding mat and like if I don't have my chili pad and like my $2,000 light that I use in the morning and blah, 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 like that kind of shit.
Yeah. And getting sunlight in your eyes when you first wake up or anytime you want to be awake. I mean, that's such a powerful hardwired mechanism in all mammals. That it's just, that's the reason I probably, I've said it so many millions of times on the internet now, people probably roll their eyes, but I would say, if you're not doing that, you're not really setting the clock. And so the rest of the stuff is secondary. But I agree. I think that if you're tracking things too carefully and you're too neurotic about it, then what's coming from a device, then you lose the ability to develop intuition too about your own system. And look, if you're excited about the next day, you're not going to sleep as much. Yeah. And there's actually a study showing that one of the major determinants of focus and alertness and wakefulness is how excited you are about what you're doing. And it sounds almost like a duh kind of result. But what's very interesting is that even if sleep the night before is shorter by an hour or two, if you have positive anticipation of the next day, the quality of the sleep, as taken by EEG recordings, the quality of the sleep is actually much better. So there's something about, there's a psychology to this stuff too. So I would hate for people to get so wrapped up and so neurotic about, I only slept 6 hours. I don't know if I should train today. I don't know if I should study today. The body is resilient. You don't want to drive yourself into chronic sleep deprivation, but you can still do a 20-minute meditation, listen to Reverie, drink an extra half cup of coffee, and then hit it. It's you don't want to obsess. Optimal also includes being flexible. And this is something that I will, give a nod to the folks in special operations, because they don't get to plan for game day on Sunday. Like when it's time to work, they have to work. And so what they're really good at is understanding that optimization is really about doing things mostly right most of the time, sort of 80-20. And then when it's time to lean into effort, you do it anyway. And you're a better person for it. And rather than tracking everything down to the tiniest detail. That's my feeling anyway.
One thing that I kind of popped into my head, and I want to bring it up before I forget, you were mentioning magnesium. Like you've talked about L-threonate particularly on your podcast numerous times. And like I've been interested for its applications, not just in a like there's like this weird study on L-threonate that showed like anti-DHT, like something to do with hair loss prevention. It was very interesting. And then as well, I forget what the benefits are that you talk about, how it differs from other magnesium formulations specifically. But one thing I wanted to bring up that I'm not sure if you've seen is, have you seen Rhonda Patrick's comments on L-threonate magnesium on the Joe Rogan show? She seems to think very poorly of it. She thinks you're just going to piss it all out, is what she says.
I didn't hear that comment. So yeah, I mean, in my experience and my understanding and I'll mention the sources in a moment, the scientific sources, that magnesium threonate and magnesium bisglycinate are interchangeable in my mind, but that they are both superior to other forms of magnesium for sake of sleep because of the way that they cross the blood-brain barrier and more of it is bioavailable. Now, there's a guy who I knew way back when from the neuroscience synaptic physiology world, and a guy named Guosong Liu, who is a very talented physiologist. And then one of my colleagues at UCLA, Jack Feldman, who I've been in discussions with about some of the work on magnesium threonate for its cognitive enhancing effects and maybe neuroprotective effects, also its anxiety reducing effects.
Right.
So all the data that I'm aware of point to better passage across the blood-brain barrier, more effective at creating a little bit of mild sedation and reducing anxiety. And, I should point out, when I made the mention of magnesium threonate on Rogan and on Tim Ferriss' podcast and others, so I have no relationship to any company that makes magnesium threonate. In fact, the one relationship I have to a supplement company that's related to my podcast doesn't make mag threonate. They make bisglycinate. So I'm not saying I don't collect on any mag threonate purchases. I just want to make that clear. But I would say thousands of people now have written saying that that's been very helpful for them. About 5% of people find that it gives them some gastric distress. They don't. You just have to figure it out for yourself. And then I would say that apigenin, the chamomile extract, all 50 milligrams of that seems to really accelerate the passage into sleep for a number of people. There is some question about whether or not it impacts androgen or estrogen receptors. Mate, you probably know more about this.
Yeah, it's actually used concurrently with raloxifene to enhance the pharmacologic activity of it quite significantly. That's what I'm most familiar with it. It's like an anti-gyno protocol, involves raloxifene plus apigenin. And there's definitely some interactions with estrogen receptor antagonism, perhaps, or exacerbating. I don't know if it's just, I forget exactly because it's been a while since I've looked at it, but it might even just inhibit hepatic clearance of drugs to make them more pharmacologically active. I don't necessarily know how that would play into sleep hygiene, though. I guess it must have some other satellite interactions that are more related to what you're talking about specifically.
Yeah. So on the one I'm aware of are a few studies, decent studies showing that the apigenin can increase the function of a chloride channel, which causes some hyperpolarization of the forebrain neurons. In other words, it turns off. It makes a little bit of a mild sedative. How mild, 50 milligrams, I don't think is terribly much, but it seems to be helpful for people. I suppose that for women or people who want to maintain estrogen levels, then they might want to be a little cautious with apigenin. But I know a number of women that take apigenin and don't report, altered cycles or things of that sort, but they're probably not checking that closely either. Again, you'd have to do continuous blood work over many days. It'd be really complicated, but yeah, I think that sleep supplementation, the stuff that you've talked about, and certainly that is in your supplement line for sleep, the sorts of things I talk about, I think people nowadays are really looking for things that are neither prescription drugs nor doing nothing, right? And I always say, get your behaviors right. Avoid blue light when you want to be asleep, get a lot of light when you want to be awake, et cetera, et cetera. Don't drink caffeine too close to when you want to sleep. The basic stuff, keep the room cool. But it's really terrific to see that some of these compounds that were so niche and thought to be only in, the bottom, corner of the shelf in the health food market, and the person selling it to you they didn't seem to make any sense when they spoke. Now there's some real data out there on PubMed, and it's great. Yeah. But I'll ask, I don't know Rhonda, I obviously know who she is. I'll ask her what the basis for her statement is. I only know the literature I know.
It was like urinary concentrations of it were like so dramatically high that her, I don't want to misquote her, but it was something about, she was very skeptical if it was actually crossing the blood-brain barrier when it was like nearly identical, the amount urinated out relative to ingested or something. So she thought it was basically not being like assimilated properly after oral ingestion, just being excreted almost entirely. But ultimately, if you're seeing the manifestation of like real effects, even if it's, I don't know, like I guess somewhat anecdotal, like I guess you've probably seen the actual literature to support it too, like reinforced concurrently with the anecdotal feedback. But I mean, I don't know if she's even tried it. Maybe her statement was just like based on that one study, which it sort of seemed like it might have been. But personally, I like bisglycinate, and I've used L-threonate before as well, and I don't know if I really noticed a giant difference personally.
Yeah, I think they're interchangeable. I think that, and I have recommended L-theanine before sleep. Some people don't do well with L-theanine before sleep. It makes their dreams like so crazy that they don't like it. Some people like it. I like really vivid dreams, and it doesn't bother me. So there has to be some experimentation that one does for themselves. I'll dig up and send along that paper from Guosong Liu on you probably are aware of them, the potential neuroprotective effects. Those are pretty interesting. I mean, I think I can't help but say that one thing that you and I have riffed about before is alpha GPC. It's really interesting. I mean, that literature for neuroprotection and for cognitive enhancement is really strong. I'm curious, how did you get to alpha GPC, and how did you stumble on it, and do you use it regularly or as part of a different formulation?
So it's in our main nootropic formula that's I know is it the word smart drugs or nootropics that you don't like using? I forget what.
I mean, nootropic I think is fine. The reason I didn't like this is
smart drugs because it implies like an ADHD med is like making you smarter. Is that sort of
it also right. Two things about this. So the short answer is that it's because when you're doing mental work, there's a time to be really focused and lasered into what you're doing. And that works best for learning information or for strategies you already know, and you're just trying to implement them. But when you're trying to brainstorm ideas or you're trying to come up with new ideas, that laser focus is actually a barrier to integrating knowledge, right? Because hyperlinearity of thought is wonderful for hyperlinear tasks, right?
Right.
So when that was me doing a little bit of public prodding to the community to try and get them to build formulations that were good for focus, other formulations that were superior for creativity, other formulations that were good for other kinds of things. And so it was a little bit of me just kind of prodding and poking back on the smart drug thing. But nootropic, I think, is now an accepted lingo, and I don't have a problem with that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so the alpha GPC for me, some of it was related to the studies on force production in the gym. Like I would assume like the motor unit recruitment portion of it is obviously highly appealing to individuals who are trying to especially leverage ergogenic aids that have nothing to do with like people bomb themselves with enough stimulants as is, having an adequate amount. Like I also have, I don't know if you've heard of C67T, what is it, homozygous for MTHFR. It's like the worst methylation impairment you can have via, like a genetic analysis. Anyway, so like having adequate choline, having, as a result, adequate methyl donors, having ways to offset the depletion of methyl donors through adequate creatine supplementation, betaine, et cetera. That kind of stuff was all implemented into my personal supplementation regimen to keep my homocysteine in check and just kind of maintain adequate neurological health and, proper functioning in an array of different ways. But the most highly applicable and reason I included it in our nootropic formula at such a high dose is it's like, I would say, one of the most highly reinforced like neurological aids or cognitive enhancing elements that you'll find in the literature for offsetting neurodegeneration while concurrently helping actual athletic performance, which I think, like, obviously when you look into how like muscle firing even works with like the recruitment of like acetylcholine and stuff, it's kind of obvious that whatever is working the best from that vector is probably one of the supplements you want to lean into the hardest if you're deprived of it. Like, obviously, if you have an adequate supply of choline from your diet, maybe you don't need it, but a lot of people are not getting enough, liver, eggs, like whatever it is that they're getting their choline from. So the alpha GPC component, for me, is like one of the most useful nootropic agents you could possibly deploy. And it's one of those things where, like a multivitamin, for example, perhaps not everyone is deficient in, I don't know, random vitamins that they're going to get backfilled from a multivitamin. Like I'm sure a lot are, but with choline specifically, I find it's very infrequent that somebody's diet is sort of representative of what I've seen in the literature to be like a decent, like adequate amount of choline. And especially with the prevalence of methylation impairments in the general population now, like seems quite common. So I don't know, for me, it's just like has multifaceted purposes, and it's just like one of the most effective nootropic agents for, actual like neurological benefits, but also transfers into like physical endeavors too. So that's kind of how I saw it.
Yeah, I certainly take 300 milligrams of alpha GPC from time to time, and will take some phenylethylamine or
You're really sensitive to stuff, eh? Like you take low doses of everything. Like 300 milligrams is not very much.
Yeah, very low dose. I might be, there's about 5 to 7% of people that are hypersensitive to medication of any kind. I might be in that category. It's hard to know, but I've always required, a bare minimum of something to really detect whether or not it's working for me or not. And I've discovered some other hypersensitivities. Like for instance, this is one that I discovered. It was just really unpleasant, which was, a few years ago when everyone was really excited about turmeric. I took some turmeric and I noticed that I just didn't feel right. I didn't feel like me. I felt really flat, and I sort of lost my edge, and I was like, what is going on?
Was it the anti-androgen component?
It flatlined my DHT.
Oh my God.
It was unbelievable. And I've never experienced anything quite like it. And then I came off that. A friend, a physician, said, oh, there is this kind of odd evidence, but it's there about, curcumin and DHT. And so I came off it, and I was immediately, took a day or two to clear out, but fine. And so some people are very sensitive. And then, and I'm reluctant to say that because I know that a lot of people consume it and they'll think, oh no, that's what's going on.
I think it's important that people know about the potential, like the seesaw risk too of like some of the health supplements, because they think I take my curcumin, I take my, I don't know, citrus bergamot, I take my astragalus, I take all these things that are, herbal ways that are natural of like attenuating potential cancer risk or this or that, or antioxidants. And there's no downside. It's only healthy, but sometimes they may be like creating issues that they didn't even know or exacerbating them. Like curcumin is very potent. Well, not a very potent anti-androgen, but in some individuals, obviously like pretty substantial enough to have a manifestation of like, like hypogonadal symptoms, perhaps even. Like it's crazy.
It's really wild. It turned me on to the fact that plant compounds are powerful, and be interesting to talk about this a little bit. A different this is anecdotal, but there is some scientific data that I'd love your thoughts on as well. When I was in college, so I'm not a cannabis user. I'm not. This doesn't come from a moral place. Drugs and alcohol have never really done much for me. I don't have an orientation toward them. I enjoy work and training, and I enjoy other things, but I drink very seldom. And when I do drink, I don't drink very much. And I've never really liked cannabis or THC, but I had a couple of roommates when I was in college who were really into training and were very healthy, didn't look like they had any kind of, at least from the look of them, didn't look like they had any kind of hypogonadal type symptoms, and got pretty severe cases of gynecomastia from marijuana.
Is that chronic use or like acute? Like, because one thing that brings up, and that's interesting, is certain individuals in the UFC, for example, namely the middleweight champion who's undefeated in his weight class, did have a manifestation of pretty bad gynecomastia recently out of seemingly nowhere. And it led to a lot of, he's a guy, Israel Adesanya. Have you seen I don't know how much you follow
him. I know of him, but I don't know. Well, I've been out to the UFC training center before because we actually have a collaboration that's brewing there with between my lab and another lab at Stanford and Duncan French out there. It's early days. It hasn't been stamped down yet, but it's
okay. Feel free to skim over this question if you think it's like too problematic with your relationship. But this guy, he's undefeated in his weight class, and it's interesting because he calls out like juice heads all the time, or guys that he thinks are on gear by the look of their physique. And he's a highly skilled fighter, and he still beats these guys who are like totally out muscling him from they look like, just beasts, and then he still, dismantles them. But not the most recent fight he had, but one of them, he was fighting a guy named Paulo Costa, which is like one of the most sauced up looking guys in the entire UFC. And he would, constantly, berating him about being on sauce, and, he takes a ton of steroids and blah, blah, blah. And then at the weigh-ins, Israel shows up with the manifestation of like one of the worst unilateral gynecomastia cases I've ever seen in the UFC, and just doesn't talk about it, doesn't touch on anything. People are asking about it in the post-fight conference. He says, "Why are you looking at my tits?" Blah, blah, blah. He just doesn't want to talk about it. And eventually, a lot of people, there's a lot of speculation that if you see a random manifestation of gyno out of nowhere, you think automatically this guy has significantly altered his hormone profile in some way that is causing an estrogen to androgen imbalance, or progestogenic activity, or IGF-1 or something that's causing an exacerbation of tissue development. And he's a well-known, cannabis user. He's prevalently, used it. He's very, very outspoken about his use of it, but it's not like he has only just started smoking recently. Like, he's always been doing it for years, and he's still a relatively young guy. I think he's like 31 or 30 or something like that. So for randomly him to get gyno out of nowhere, despite having used cannabis for years prior, it really led to a lot of accusations about steroid use, and he claims it was the cannabis use. So I'm wondering, first of all, I don't know if you saw that guy, or what do you think there would be any credibility to his statements? And your friends, was that acute exposure or chronic that led to that?
Okay. So, I mean, I don't know the situation with,
it would be kind of hard for me to just.
Yeah, I couldn't even speculate about him. Although I will say that the testing in the UFC is extremely stringent. I know, and I'm in touch with some of the folks out there. They take that very seriously because it's a sport where people are harming one another, not just playing a sport, right? So, I do some work with athletes in other sports. I mean, there are professional sports leagues for which hormone augmentation is actually allowed if people have been injured. I won't reveal what major organizations those are, but I think when people see it, now this is non-UFC. I want to be very clear, non-UFC. I can say that with certainty.
The UFC already weeded out the TRT debacle, whereas other leagues in particular are not as stringent about even monitoring that. And that's significant, let alone they're on top of as much as they can physically be on top of with high level randomization and frequency, whereas other leagues, not so much. But anyways, continue.
Right. So the cases that I was witness to that in college were people who ramped up their cannabis use and experience gyno. Now what's interesting is if you look at the scientific data, the peer-reviewed data on cannabis and testosterone, it's all over the place. Some studies say it makes testosterone go up. Other studies say it makes testosterone go down. And when you dig into the methods sections on these papers, which I've done, what you find is that the fact that it's all over the place makes total sense. Derek, you would immediately know why this was the case because, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, but in some cases, they're testing it like immediately after use. In other cases, they're looking at it 2 days later. So you can imagine a situation where there's a big increase in testosterone, then an aromatization that's may or may not have anything to do with the cannabis. And I mean, the data are all over the place because the testing times relative to the cannabis use are all over the place. And so I think if I had to speculate on what is relevant for most people, I would say that everybody is going to react differently. I doubt it's completely random. We could say people are going to react differently without saying that everyone's going to have a vastly different response. You can imagine it's kind of a bimodal distribution where maybe 60 or 70% of people will not experience much or a significant change in their endocrine profile or estrogen profile. But then there are going to be a subset of individuals, maybe 10 or 15, that are going to have huge increases in aromatization. And I think that's what you see. And that's why things get the reputation as causing blank and blank. And so also the one thing is what people often don't talk about, I'd love your thoughts on this, is whenever people see gynecomastia in an athlete, they speculate, they're using testosterone. However, it could be because they came off.
I think that's more common because it's like in sport, you would be pretty, even if you were in a very basic, like a league with rudimentary basic testing, you only have so much leeway with a bioidentical like testosterone, whereby you're not exceeding threshold ratios for, testosterone, epitestosterone, and a variety of other biomarkers or urine markers that they'll be checking for like, ratios and whatnot. But in like, as far as like the amount you can actually get away with is going to be like closer to, I don't know, like high normal, borderline super physiological TRT levels if you're not like have like a huge appetite for risk, I guess, in general. So, like for me, like I would assume a lot of the case, the hormonal imbalance is going to be caused by a crash and or, a subsequent pulling out of those hormones and leaving you in that deprived environment where you have that imbalance or total deficiency of androgen offsetting estrogen-induced RNA transcription at the receptor site to actually prevent that glandular development from occurring. So like in general, the manifestation of gyno is like most often a case of like guys who are using excessive amounts of compounds that are substrates for aromatase, or individuals who have like hypogonadal men, so much gyno in hypogonadal men, despite the fact that they have low T and like low amounts of estrogen, on paper, perhaps they still have manifestations of gynecomastia. And you would think, why is their estrogen in range, but they still have, a tit developing? Like that's why. Yeah.
And there's a very interesting interaction between prolactin and estrogen, at least in the brain. And I think it was, I probably in the past, I've tried to emphasize the importance of prolactin, probably to the detriment of the.
I think that might have been like our one, big, point that I touched on the Joe Rogan thing. But anyways, continue.
Totally cool. Yeah, no, and I think that totally valid to assess what other information that's out there. And the point that here's how I would say I view it, which is that prolactin and estrogen operate on a parallel pathway. There are a lot of systems in the brain, as and body that are push-pull, right? Dopamine and prolactin are very push-pull. Surprisingly, testosterone and estrogen are not as much push-pull, as they tend to kind of float up and down together in parallel. But, in most individuals, testosterone is just higher. So the ratios tend to follow in general, right? But prolactin and testosterone, because of the relationship between dopamine and testosterone being very much in parallel, then when anytime you adjust down dopamine and prolactin goes up, there tends to be both a slight blunting of testosterone levels as well as an amplification of estrogen. And that's when I think this ratio of estrogen and testosterone starts to get a little wonky, to the point where the way I view it is that prolactin is either directly or indirectly making the tissue of the body more sensitive to low amounts of estrogen that are there. And this is exactly the way you describe these hypogonadal men who have low levels of testosterone because they're hypogonadal. They have low levels of estrogen, but those low levels of estrogen are able to have an amplified or exacerbated effect on the tissue because the levels of prolactin are sort of synergizing that. Yeah. And obviously this is happening on different time scales. It's very hard to parse. I mean, when you start to realize, the hormone systems are so incredible because they work on fast time scales, medium time scales, and short time scales, and they're even controlling gene expression. So it's like, it's really, it's hard to tease apart. But I think that, well, isn't there a practice in the bodybuilding community of people taking either pro-dopamine or anti-prolactin?
Yeah. So like people oftentimes when they use progestogenic compounds that they think are going to raise their prolactin. And in general, what we see is like the prolactin increase is usually coming as a consequence of high estrogen. Like I think that's sort of like you meant the parallel of estrogen going up sort of like encourages the prolactin to rise in unison. Is that accurate?
Yep.
Yeah. So basically you see these individuals using cabergoline or pramipexole to try and attenuate the prolactin side of the equation, whilst concurrently using aromatase inhibitors to attenuate the estrogen side of the equation. They end up on like a clusterfuck of like cardiotoxic and neurotoxic drugs in order to just like run their too high of a dose of like exotic compound to grow muscle. And it's just like, obviously there's a smarter way to design like a, performance enhancing drug regimen where you're not on a cocktail of things to counteract the bad part of the drug that you probably shouldn't be using, or the dosage that you're using is just exceedingly high for what you're trying to get out of it. But yeah, like I think that's also what causes the gyno development in puberty so significantly is the giant spike in GH and IGF-1 as a consequence of like trying to like obviously grow a goddamn like skeleton to, significantly bigger proportions. You have the estrogen, actual stimulation of breast tissue development, but also the GH and downstream IGF-1 seems to be proliferative as well. And then the prolactin on the prolactin agonism of the receptor, as well as progestogenic activity potentially from progesterone, appears to be stimulatory as well. And the only like antagonist you really have from all of that occurring is androgen. So if you're hypogonadal and you have like this layering of like, I don't know, IGF-1, estrogen, even if it's deprived, but you still have some, and then you have the prolactin thing that you said would otherwise exacerbate it too. I don't know, progestogenic activity, it seems to all be cumulatively just like problematic in that, development. I think that's probably what leads to a lot of, I think the GH IGF-1 thing is huge in the pubertal gyno manifestation, but in the hypogonadal men, I think it's like the lack of androgen relative to all these like stimulatory inputs that people are not considering for sure. But yeah, in the bodybuilding community, I tend to go on tangents, my bad. But yeah, they use cabergoline and pramipexole.
Well, yeah, I asked because they're doing all this experimentation, and it's sort of an interesting data set, so to speak. What's I think your comment about puberty is a really important one. I've told David Sinclair this, and I'll say it here again. I mean, puberty is a very interesting stage of human development because, first of all, it's the fastest rate of aging that anyone will undergo. I mean, if you look at just as a plot of body transformation, as you mentioned, it's a tremendous overhaul of all the systems and tissues of the body. I think that if people want to learn a lot about how hormones impact the brain and body, studying the biology of puberty is fascinating. Yeah. And obviously you know this literature right down to the guts, but the interactions between the hypothalamus and the pituitary and the body at this time and is dramatic. And you're talking about IGF-1 and growth hormone. I think I'm curious to your thoughts on peptides. So right now there's a huge surge in the number of people that are interested in peptides because it sounds not as perhaps scary to them as it does hormone augmentation. Again, and I really, I don't think that people should run out and start tinkering with their endocrinology. I mean, you need to work with a physician if you're going to do that at all. And ideally it's because there's a real clinical need, but peptides are interesting because there are a couple issues that come to mind. One is, so I've seen examples of people who take things like sermorelin, tesamorelin, ipamorelin in order to get some more growth hormone release in sleep and end up with doubling or even tripling of their prostate specific antigen. Have you heard about this?
Yeah, I heard it from you specifically, and I remember I probably wrote it on like a topic list to dive into more, but I don't know what would cause that specifically. Although I do know the function by which a lot of these peptides work is through agonism of the ghrelin receptor, which has significant interactions with stress as well. So it's not just about, I think a lot of people, they think you take this peptide and all of a sudden your pituitary just like spits out more GH or something. But in reality, it's stimulating a receptor that is designed to make you hungry. And in rodents, it's actually something they chronically agonize to induce PTSD, which is like kind of sketchy when you think about, I'm not saying you shouldn't use peptides, by the way, but in general, like some of them, like the ones that are more chronic around the clock and aren't like pulsatile in nature, like there's this one called ibutamoren, MK677, and it's highly, advantageous because it's orally administered. It's very bioavailable. It works on like a 24-hour like cycle, essentially. Like you can actually maintain your IGF-1 for upwards of 24 hours and get it from like a deficient state up to the top end of the reference range. But it's very potent at agonizing this ghrelin receptor, which not only makes you ridiculously hungry and you end up eating way more than you should, which is obviously, not great for some individuals, especially like fitness individuals that don't want to, overeat in general. But as a consequence of that, there seems to be some interaction with like a high stress response, which I don't know if downstream that has something to do with, like, I don't see it in my head. I can't piece together why that would downstream lead to a spike in PSA, given that you're dealing with GH downstream leading to growth factor production as a consequence of making you very, very hungry and stressed out potentially. I don't see where that would interplay at all, but just notable nonetheless that is like the receptor that is responsible for actually stimulating your body to make that growth hormone. It's not just like pituitary make growth hormone. There's like, like precursor things that have to happen first. So
they're very interesting. Well, the one of the things that I find interesting about sermorelin and ipamorelin is that, and tesamorelin in particular, is that it seems that they can change gene expression in the hypothalamus such that if people are using them for short periods of time, 3 days or so, and then taking some days off, that the effects tend to linger. And so I think, one of the reasons for bringing this up is that I've heard that out there, the peptides, some of them are contaminated with lipopolysaccharide, with LPS. In laboratory, we inject LPS in order to study fever, to induce fever. It's called a pyrogen because it increases fever. So it's an experimental tool.
Back in the day, they used to spike underground growth hormone with anti-diuretic to make you hold more water, to make you think your GH is more potent. So that's another practice in the underground community when they make peptides. But anyway, just worth mentioning.
Yeah, no, it's really important to bring this up. I think that the peptide thing is a really barbed wire topic because there are many sources, and yet the how clean those sources are is really variable. There are compounding labs that work with physicians, and I think that's ultimately, and those as far as I understand are producing essentially what they say they are and cleaning out the LPS. But the lipopolysaccharide, it's not something that you want going into your body chronically. That's not going to be a good situation. But
even like synthetic carrier oils and stuff in underground gear, like a lot of people think, why would I spend more money on a compounded testosterone for my TRT when I can just buy underground gear that it's not very cheap to make testosterone, or it's not very expensive to make testosterone. It's very easy to get relatively accurately dosed testosterone, but it's like the way these bathtub chemists, obviously some better than others, but sometimes they'll make these kind of compounds in a way that's like it'll spike your C-reactive protein from like 0.3 up to like 40, like it's crazy. And it's like, you don't actually think about that stuff or even realize it because you probably don't even check your blood work, let alone your C-reactive protein in your blood work. But that's the kind of stuff that differentiates pharma from underground in some cases. And I wouldn't be surprised if you see the manifestations of some like really weird aberrations in your blood work when you take underground peptides, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, elevated C-reactive protein, as you know, is terrible. It's gonna, it puts people at risk for macular degeneration, and at least to this point in human history, we don't have a way to regenerate the retina once it's gone, so that's bad. Heart health, etc. Yeah, I think this is again where the reason why I'm a big believer in people getting blood work, not necessarily doing anything about altering their endocrinology, except really mastering the lifestyle factors. It always, I think some people think it sounds boring, but if you get those lifestyle factors right, you can get a lot out of that. And looking at the long arc of how to do things. I mean, I think that, and then working with a board certified MD is far and away the best way to do things, because they know a lot. I mean, one of the wonderful things that medical doctors have is a very extensive training, and they understand, they have that firsthand experience of working with people of a variety of backgrounds. So I think, Kyle's excellent. There are other excellent people out there too, of course, but I think that you and I very much see eye to eye on this.
Yeah. As far as so you mentioned how you're sort of like a hyper responder to certain supplements and stimulants, presumably. Did you find a similar outcome with testosterone? Because I know recently you've publicly come out and talked about how you're on TRT now, where you just have like a crazy spike in libido that was like overwhelming, and it was like making you unproductive, or crazy increases in gym performance, or were you a hyper responder to T, or what happened with that?
Yeah. So just to give a little backshot, the reason Derek knows about this is recently I disclosed. So I never touched any kind of hormone augmentation except over-the-counter supplementation until I was 45, and I'm happy to disclose what my numbers were over the years. The first time I got my blood work done, I was in my early 30s. I did have curiosity. I wish I had done it earlier out of curiosity. I was the typical reference range, at least in the US, is somewhere between 300 and 900 nanograms per deciliter. I wasn't particularly high or particularly low. I was in the low 6 range or so. Got it tested twice, and both times it was, I think, like 620, 650, somewhere in that range. Okay. So decided to just stay with that. And that's when a few years later, I would say 5 years later, and I should say that by adjusting training frequency, that had a big impact for me. So if I do hard warm up and then do hard training for 45 or 50 minutes, 4 or 5 times a week, so this would be resistance training, then I see bumps in those numbers, and then they never go below the numbers I just referred to. This was my reason for it. If I train longer than that, if I'm doing 90-minute, 2 hour, never 2 hours, but 90-minute sessions, they would start to go down a bit. And, that's a real thing, that hour mark. It's not like a gate shuts, but it's a real thing. Then, excuse me, then somewhere in my early 40s, I started trying a huge range of over-the-counter supplements one by one while doing blood work. I have a spreadsheet that's just super extensive. These are just my personal data, but all the things that you hear out there, I didn't try all of them, but I tried a number of them. Most of them didn't work for me. The 2 things that were effective for me were ones that I've talked about before. And then I should mention, I have no financial relationship to these, and I'm not recommending anyone take them. I'm just reporting my experience, which were 400 milligrams of Tonga Ali. Turns out that there's Malaysian version of this, and there's an Indonesian version. And the Indonesian, I'm getting reports back now from people that are out there that have heard me talk about this, that it's the Indonesian version that's particularly potent, and the Malaysian version might not be at all. So this is an ongoing thing, but that combined, it's supposed to lower sex hormone binding globulin. My bound T wasn't particularly high, but my free T wasn't particularly high either. So Pseudohermaphrodites agrestis at 600 milligrams, which is actually 1/3 of what's recommended on the bottle.
How did you stumble across that anyway? Because I could understand the Tonkat, because that's like a very, very, I don't know, well-established, kind of long-standing. If you were going to say, what are the natural T boosters? Most people have heard of Tribulus. Not that I'm saying it's good. I'm just saying what people have heard of. People have heard of Tribulus. People have heard of, Maca, maybe. They've heard of Tonkat Ali, Long Jack. But then for Dojo, I had never heard of it before you started talking about it. How did you end up stumbling across that?
Yeah. A friend who is also a endocrinologist, and I got into a conversation about plant compounds that affect the endocrine systems of the animals that eat them. And there are a lot of plants make compounds that are out there to adjust the fertility and/or populations of the animals that forage on them.
Yeah.
And so I thought, oh, this is kind of an interesting compound, and it was available. I took it, and for me, those two things combined, again, just for me, led to about I basically increased that number to high sevens, low 800 nanograms per deciliter. Maintained that for several years. Definitely. People ask, was I cycling it? Yeah, every 3 or 4 months or so, I'd come off for 8 weeks or so. Was monitoring my liver enzymes and other profiles. I thought, well, this is pretty interesting. And then some of the communities that I've consulted for started showing me data from their use, and it was like pretty interesting. And so I've seen a range of responses. So let me be very clear: sourcing is key. I think there's probably a huge range of quality out there. There's not a lot of data on safety out there. Everyone has to monitor those things for themselves. There's not a ton of data on mechanism. It's more hypothesized mechanism. Here's what's interesting. Pseudohermaphrodites aggressiva seems to increase luteinizing hormone in a non-positive feedback or negative feedback type way. So in other words, it'll raise luteinizing hormone sometimes into supraphysiological ranges, and doesn't seem to shut down natural luteinizing hormone production.
So FSH concurrently doesn't budge, but LH just singularly increases?
Yeah, which is kind of interesting.
Now, I'm assuming I don't even think this would be based on I don't know if this would be an accurate way to determine, but have you seen anybody's gonadotropin releasing hormone assessment before and after using it? Because I'm wondering, thinking how would you singularly heighten LH and not, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it could be that it's actually having a direct effect on the pituitary, but that's a speculation. The most dramatic shifts I've seen were when people were suffering from symptoms of low testosterone. So a couple individuals that were down in the mid 200s, these are nanogram per deciliter, obviously 200s. Took them and saw huge, enormous increases, like up to high 8s, low 9. But then again, people have written to me and said, oh, I didn't see a few. I would say only a select number of people have written to me and said, I didn't see anything. It was a modest bump.
Were those sustained increases going from like literal hypogonadal territory up to 700, 800?
Yeah. And who knows whether I haven't been in touch with them in the last 6 months or so, but I would imagine I would have heard from them if things weren't going well. And then there's some people who are in their 70s who, were not interested in TRT. Again, I wasn't recommending this. They just heard me talk about it, took it and seemed to report subjectively just better feelings of well-being, strength in the gym, slight libido increases, etc. Okay. So that was essentially 5 years. And then when on my 45th birthday, the new year of after my 45th birthday, I'm working on a book essentially about hormones and their relationship to the brain. And so my numbers were sitting as I mentioned, in the mid 7s, low 8s kind of thing.
Before we get into your TRT, this is actually going to be this is going to be easy to clip because I definitely want to have a natural T booster section of this podcast. So
sure. And we can talk about a couple other things.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to fully parse out the statistics because I hear people talk about the total T increases from these two supplements a lot, but I haven't heard, like you mentioned, the mechanism of action of Tomcat specifically is SHBG reduction potentially.
Okay, that's an important question. On paper, that's the way it's supposed to work. I have not seen massive reductions in SHBG from Indonesian Tonga Ali.
Because I'm thinking if it was SHBG being lowered, you would not see that. The increase in total T does not seem to line up with that. So I'm thinking this is what I've seen personally. I just put it in the chat. It says hormonally, Tomcat appears to have remarkable anti-estrogenic effects in vitro and has a potency similar to tamoxifen when injected. So that is the traditional PCT drug for bodybuilders to recover through negative feedback to the HPTA by occupying estrogen receptors, which, interesting regarding the macular degeneration thing, makes me a little bit weary of the Tomcat because if it's again, it seems like there's no manifestation of side effects that would be representative of this, which is good news. And this is like a long-standing supplement. I'm sure somebody would have reported it by now. But like chronic tamoxifen exposure, the main issue is like ocular like degeneration, essentially, like your actual eye just going to shit. So that was my only concern with this compound. But it seems like it does not, like, as far as clarifying the mechanism, because for you, what kind of increases did you see in free T compared to your total T? And then the fact that you saw no changes in your SHBG makes me think it's facilitated more through this comparable to SERM's activity is sort of what I'm thinking.
Yeah, so it was a modest decrease in SHBG, and it was a modest increase in free testosterone, nothing too severe. So I think the mechanism that you're proposing is a very reasonable one. I mean, the first of all, just to be really clear, because of the way that sometimes people hear these things is different than the way that maybe you and I might think they're going to hear them. So, right, this is we're kind of shouting into a tunnel, and then it's being collected on the other end.
Yeah.
And so, lifestyle, get things right. First, that includes not overtraining. Overtraining is a real thing, and by overtraining can be frequency and or duration of workouts. I know that's sort of kind of old news, and people are like, oh yeah, but it's a real thing. Yeah. You know, if you are blasting your adrenals with stimulants and pre-workouts 6 days a week, and you're in there 90 minutes, and you're, you know, doing every set to failure, you unless your androgen backdrop is of a particular level, you're not going to be able to manage that. It's gonna send you dissolving into a puddle of tears at some point. So I think that getting sleep right, et cetera, nutrition, being sufficiently nourished is important. But then, yeah, these supplements are the two that, among the many things that I explored, had effects, and that other people I know got effects from them. Some people don't, and some people get big effects, and some people smaller. So I just want to, emphasize that. The cycles that I've heard of people doing them are anywhere from 12 to 16 weeks, sometimes longer, but then taking 8 weeks off or so, and then just hopping right back on. There's no real rationale for cycling off, to be honest. I think people just sort of do it.
You saw no dips in total T, like when you cycled off? Like
no, you do. Yeah, okay. When you cycle off, you see that drop, which actually is nice, right? That's a negative control experiment.
Yeah. So do you have like a similar to your, like, how you mention often how with dopamine, if you elevate your state to super physiologic, you can expect a consequent or a subsequent drop below baseline periodically while you kind of reach homeostasis. When you cycle off this stuff, obviously a lot of people's concern off the bat is, am I going to feel even worse than before I got on it? Dipping, if I'm literally hypogonadal and I'm getting on a natural T booster that is like rectifying my situation, I would be quite hesitant to cycle off. And I can see how, like, hypothetically, I guess you don't need to cycle off, but I don't know the chronic exposure, potential of this stuff when it comes to, like, I speculate it must act as a SERM for it to have such a significant impact on total T increase with no, like, significant impact on, like, it's either inhibiting aromatase or acting as a SERM. And it seems like in vitro it is acting as a SERM, and maybe it has some impact on SHBG, but ultimately the total T increase is regulated through the HPTA in some aspect. Maybe the Fedoja somehow has like this interesting, like, pituitary, I don't know, specific effect, but the Tomcat for sure, like, I would be a little bit hesitant to be like, use something that's comparable to Novadex like forever. So during that subsequent, like, off cycle period, should people expect that they have a dip that feels just like going back to their baseline state prior to the deployment of it? Or do you have, like, because you've exposed your brain to this like new level of androgenic signaling, do you experience like a downswing, or what should people in general expect during that time?
Yeah, it's not that significant a downswing, because it's not that significant an upswing when you are taking it, right? I mean, for most people, right? So, but here's something that I think is really valuable. In any time there's a cycling off, or let's say, and the analogous situation would be someone who's taking a lot of pre-workout that's loaded with tyrosine and alpha GPC and caffeine, and getting the massive stimulation from that. And then they decide, I want this to continue to work, so I'm going to stop taking it for a while. Of course, you're going to feel a dip. What can you do to mitigate that so that you're not dropping way below baseline? Well, the solution in my mind would be, for instance, to continue to train, certainly, but maybe those training sessions are 40 minutes total, 10 minutes of warm up, and then hitting it really, really hard for 40 minutes. So you're sort of offsetting some of the additional stress, and you're sort of pressing on the pedal harder, so to speak, of the androgenic stimulus. Because one thing that's very real, and we have a podcast episode coming out with Duncan French in next month, where, you know, his main graduate thesis work was showing what specific types of set rep regimens and total duration training really boost testosterone. Because we all hear that training induces testosterone, big compound movements, but no one's actually really parsed that until he came along.
Right.
And those training regimens are very interesting. Those training regimens involve 10 sets of 10, where you put whatever weight on the bar. These are compound movements to maintain about an 80 to 85% of one repetition maximum. And you're changing the weight from set to set so that you can always get those 10 repetitions. You often need spotters for this because you can't always gauge exactly. With 2 minutes rest in between. Brutal. If you've been there, that's intense, right? Yeah. And nothing else that workout. And that's done twice a week. And then they measure serum testosterone, and they get these very impressive increases in serum testosterone compared to, say, the hour-long typical training session of your people doing your, you know, dips inside, you know, and you know, lateral raises and things of that sort. So when you start to think about training as a androgen stimulus, not just a hypertrophy stimulus, right? Then what I would say is, then you can start to look at that as a behavioral way to offset some of this natural dip that you would expect coming off of anything, whether or not it's a dopaminergic agent, like whether or not it's a androgenic agent or an indirectly androgenic agent, like in this case, we're viewing Tongat. So, you know, that 8 weeks also could be a time where, you know, some people are only training in the gym, but some people might do more running, for instance, where it's more of it's a different type of movement where you don't need to be as, you know, on the gas pedal and you know, gritting your teeth and this sort of thing. So I think that one thing that's often overlooked is the way to modulate training in the on and off cycles of anything. And this is something that people in the old days really understood, because there wasn't this overemphasis on pharmacology. It was a component, but it was more like, how do you train under conditions where you're extremely supported by pharmacology? That was the question then. Then it was, how do you train when you're not supported or you're trying to make it back? Well, when you're trying to make it back to a place when you're not supported, it makes perfect sense that you would train harder and shorter to try and get a naturally occurring stimulus in your system. And I think the problem a lot of people run into is they think either they stop training, or worse, perhaps even, they think, oh, I'm just gonna do everything I have to, stimulants, whatever I have to in order to just train because I want to maintain. And then all you end up doing is sending your system into a catabolic state.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So it involves being, you know, there's a bit of a kind of a push and a pull with these things. And I think that it makes perfect sense that when people are assisted by anything, that they can train more. I mean, that's the reason most athletes who aren't interested in more muscle, why they take performance enhancing drugs. They just want to be able to train more and recover. So
is there, like you mentioned, how you tried a laundry list of other like traditional T boosting supplements? Was there any that you felt were like, some of them are pretty, I guess, more popular than Fedoja and are like regarded to be like relatively efficacious? So things like ashwagandha or something like a boron for SHBG manipulation. Do you see those as having any utility at all, or they're just like so negligible? Not really.
Yeah, I have the most of these. I'm sure you have the lists that are pretty incredible as well.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, if the joke is, you know, if you were to ask me what I take, and we could do I could mention, I take a lot of supplements, but most of them are of the kind of conventional kind, right? You know, fish oil, some D3, some zinc, grapeseed extract, some ginger, nothing that is going to be particularly surprising. You know, creatine obviously is a good supplement for raising DHT. Some people are DHT hyper responders to creatine. I know people who truly start losing their hair when they take DHT.
Yeah. Anecdotally, it seems like despite it, it's not like there's a lot of data to reinforce it, but it does seem like it has interactions with other things too, not just from like a 5-alpha reduction side of things, like myostatin, and I would assume AR content potentially / like sensitivity to androgens in general. But yeah, so the laundry list of T boosters, you thought nothing really stood out?
Yeah. So again, this was all in research I thought it'd be fun to have a scientist perspective on some of this. So this is now we're talking about personal explorations, just to be clear. I think there were a number of things like D-aspartate.
D-aspartic acid.
Yeah, it did nothing for me whatsoever. There were tribulus. So tribulus was interesting, a very transient, noticeable effect, and then nothing after about 2-3 days. Just didn't make much of an impact. There is a pretty significant effect of, I'm almost reluctant to say it because I don't recommend it, but bulbine natalensis will definitely increase the numbers, but there does appear to be some pretty serious issues around potential Leydig cell toxicity. So I think these are, now I'm sure there are people out there who know sources or ways of doing this that are different, but that one was pretty remarkable. But I wouldn't recommend it because it seemed like the toxicity issue has been demonstrated in rodents and perhaps in humans as well. Are you familiar with it?
No, but I know some of the scrutiny on Fedoja has been somewhat close to that. Like it sounded like it wasn't in humans that this happened, but it was like something to do with I don't know, testicular toxicity in some aspect, or like speculated. Yeah. I don't know if that's like similar though, or has any overlap whatsoever, because that was again, like no one even really knows how it works, let alone if it's going to cause any side effects, and doesn't seem to be.
Bulbine has some known toxicity at high doses. I think the data on
adverse effects on both kidney and livers.
I think bulbine is potentially hazardous. So those were I think that grabs the important parameters. It was around as I mentioned, January this year, then that I started saying, okay, well, is there anything out there that I should test for this, and keeping my numbers and a regimented exploration for sake of this, potentially a book or a podcast. I was doing it for my own curiosity too. I should say none of these things led to increases that were so significant that they allowed for a complete overhaul of training, for instance, like where you could train much more and recover, or massive increases in libido or anything, maybe subtle. But I will say I'd done the work to make sure that my levels were good going in, and I would say I'd done the work. I was feeling pretty good to begin with. I wasn't suffering any specific clinical symptoms or anything of that sort.
Okay, so what you were doing is representative of what it can actually do, because your lifestyle factors, diet, etc., are all kind of like dialed in to begin with. So that's obviously
right. And I think that the reason I've mentioned it recently on podcasts and so forth is that I think that there ought to be some consideration of things between doing nothing. Obviously, there's doing nothing. There's behavioral optimization, lifestyle optimization. There's supplementation, and then there's let's say, because it's the right way to do it, is working with physician and prescription TRT. And obviously, there are a lot of people doing that nowadays. And so I've been forthcoming about the fact that I've done this experiment where, starting January this year, working with a physician, I started a simple regimen that most people would. It's the typical prescription is 0.7 mLs of 200 mg per mil testosterone cypionate. That's what they do in the States here. Typically they have you do that once a week, or if your doctor is a little bit more aware, they say twice, they break it up into two, meaning to take the total dose and divide it into two. Oftentimes they'll give you your, an anastrozole and so on. I'm telling you all these things that you know and that your listeners probably have already heard before. In my experience, it's very, very clear. It was clear to me immediately that dividing it in two was more rational. So that's how I started, 0.4 mLs. So that's going to be 80. That's equivalent to 80. If you want to talk milligrams, sometimes I think it's more useful to talk milligrams, because the typical output of the testicles is, I know that there's probably some disagreement with that, probably somewhere between 7 and 15 milligrams per day, or 7 and 20 milligrams per day. Is that
what I've seen in the literature is an average of 5 to 6 per day with a range of 3 to 10 is what I've seen personally.
Okay. So let's take let's land at 7 milligrams per day.
But oftentimes it's not really representative of that, because even if you injected 70 milligrams, once you cleave off the ester and count for like the molecular weight of the active hormone, like a lot of guys may end up feeling like shit on 70 milligrams, even though that's like high function for natural, balls. Right. But
yeah. So, and what's funny is I'd spent years in the laboratory injecting animals with various compounds and hormones and things. And so it was interesting. So and again, this was all done with a doctor legally, with supervision, et cetera. And so it was very interesting. I discovered something that won't be any surprise to you, which was that more is not better. That I did not feel good on that regimen. There's as you mentioned, some of the cardiac effects of testosterone, the negative cardiac effects are indirect because of increases in the sympathetic nervous system, right? Your autonomic nervous system, of course, as you know, has a sympathetic and a parasympathetic arm, parasympathetic being so-called rest and digest and just being calm, and sympathetic being really charged and elevated and adrenaline churning out. And it was clear that it gave almost a immediate increase in energy, et cetera, but just, it felt like too much, right? This is very subjective. And no aggression or anything like that, but it didn't feel good. And then, so eventually what I discovered over the course of several months of trying, for instance, 0.3 mLs every third day, tried that. So take 2 days off, then take another 0.3 mLs, et cetera. Then move to that. What turned out to be best for me was 0.5 mLs. So this is going to be 30 milligrams every other. 50
milligrams every other day is what you said?
No. It's 30 because it's 200 mgs per mil.
30 milligrams. Audio cut out.
Yeah, no, that's okay. So it ends up being 0.15 mLs of a 200 mg per mil concentration. So 30 mgs every other day. So you can average that to 15 milligrams per day.
Gotcha.
And that seemed to be right. Now, because I'm not a competitive athlete. I'm truly doing this to research this, what will ultimately become a written thing. I'm monitoring everything by blood work, liver enzymes, et cetera, but not taking any anastrozole because it's very clear to me, and this was discussed on my podcast with my colleague, Robert Sapolsky, but it's very clear to me that estrogen is great for maintaining neuronal function, as you mentioned, eye health, memory, that's neuronal function, but soft tissue and connective tissue health. And it just, and I'm not suffering from any gyno or any kind of, any major water retention. A few people have commented I'm a little puffier than I was at the turn of the year, but I'm willing to live with that. Now, the subjective effects, I think, are all the ones people have described before. You recover more quickly. Your energy, like for instance, it's here. It's 8:45 p.m. I had a full day, no nap. I got decent sleep last night, not great. I went back to sleep this morning for an hour after I woke up, feeling I need a little more sleep, but. Yeah, you can drill right through the day. That's a very noticeable effect. And then when it's time to go to sleep, take my sleep supplements, drink my water, and go to sleep. And so that a major subjective effect, and that's also objective, is that I used to feel pretty exhausted in the afternoon. I'd need an afternoon nap. Now it's optional. And so it's pretty remarkable. And it's something that the one thing that I think is very important that I think isn't discussed, but we talk about when I work with various communities, is that the importance of continuing to do cardiovascular work and not just weight training. I think that you think about just weight training, eating, people getting apnea. You've talked about this on your podcast, cutting off circulation, sleeping a lot, eating a lot, lifting. I mean, you're I'm not trying to be hyperbolic here. People are killing themselves that way. That's how you would kill an animal quickly. That's how you would shorten its life. There are other ways that, that if you really want to kill something quickly, you kill it. But which I don't recommend, but if you want to shorten the lifespan of anything, you overfeed it, you make it do hard work, you sort of create a rev in the engine, but you don't give it a place to put that. And I think that cardiovascular work, running 30, 40 minutes every other day or so, even if it's a jog, kind of zone 2 cardio, absolutely critical for keeping the blood lipids and overall sense of well-being in order. And I think for people who are not doing any hormone augmentation, that's also extremely important. And because, especially if they're younger and they already have high levels of androgens.
Yeah. Some of the literature on just like a basic 10-minute walk after like postprandial, like the effect on nutrient partitioning and just like the tolerability to the spike in glucose and getting it back to homeostasis in a faster time frame and just being more insulin sensitive. Like so many things are improved just by having like very like minor, like it's not like that cumbersome of basic exercise intertwined with your daily routine. It's definitely like massive. And people think just because I go to the gym and I hit it hard, then I'm like, I've done my due diligence, and it's not necessarily the case at all. Yeah, definitely.
And I think that I love this phrase that you use about glucose disposal, because I have a colleague, his name is Sachin Panda down at the Salk Institute, and he's sort of one of the original people to formalize intermittent fasting, so-called time restricted.
Highly recommend his book, by the way. Very good.
Yeah, the Circadian Code. He's really terrific. A really excellent scientist. And your blood glucose level doesn't just go to zero immediately after you take your last bite. So rather than thinking about whether or not you're eating or not eating, it's better to think about, as whether or not your body is in a fed or fasted state, and how fed or how fasted. So if you just ate, it's pretty well fed, depending on what you ate, of course. If you're deep into your sleep and you've been asleep for 6 hours, you're far from a fed state. When that 30-minute walk after eating a meal acts as a glucose disposal agent, it reduces your circulating blood glucose pretty significantly, not as significantly as something like berberine or, these compounds that, which will do that dramatically, but metformin and things of that sort. But, I think that, making sure glucose isn't chronically high, making sure that getting cardiovascular exercise, it's night and day. How much better people feel, how much better their blood lipid profiles are, their cardiovascular profiles of all kinds, and also their overall appearance. When somebody is just doing resistance training and they're on TRT and they're not doing any cardiovascular work, they look stressed. In fact, there's a telltale, I actually can spot it now. There's a left side vein that tends to kind of pop out when people are in this stressed mode. And this has to do with actually return of blood flow from the heart. It's actually, I've talked to some of my colleagues about this, and you can kind of spot when someone is in that chronic hypertension state. It's not a leanness thing. It's really, they're stressed. And, as somebody who's 46 now, these are serious considerations, but they're serious considerations if you're in your 20s too, right? You seem to be a pretty relaxed Canadian, mellow,
You would think, man, but I'm like highly, like when you talked about being highly anticipating the next day and being excited to get the day started, like me, I don't really have an off switch from work. So I often find myself like, just gearing to go constantly. So like I'm mellow in my
wait, let's be clear what we mean. You don't mean gearing to go constantly.
No. I mean like, not like, you know what I mean? Like, or actually maybe you don't know, but yeah, like I'm just constantly I don't know, like just ready to, I don't know. I'm like very driven and very goal oriented and constantly like thinking about what I could be doing to optimize my time. And sometimes that's at the detriment of being able to live in the moment and actually be relaxed and get into like a parasympathetic state. So I can be somewhat like sympathetically dominant, like perpetually around the clock, to be honest. But I don't think that translates into my like how I behave as much. You can't tell as much. Like I do seem pretty laid back and relaxed, but in my actual head, not as much as I should be, to be honest.
I like to think, different people have different temperaments. I had a bulldog. He was very large, but he could really activate, but most of the time he was pretty lazy. But yeah, so you've got a steed of Clydesdales in your head. That's good. That's a good way to be. I mean, I think that I've always had a lot of energy. I've always been, interested in learning as much as I can and doing a lot. I think that with each passing year, as the more I've emphasized sleep and regimen, the easier it's become to do things without feeling like there's, like things are coming apart at the seams. And I think that, but look, one of the beauties of something like graduate school or having a new business or something at a time when if you don't have a family, or even if you do, is that you can just lean full tilt into that. And that's a great thing, because there aren't as many people who need your time and attention. Yeah.
Have you noticed a big difference on how driven you are on TRT versus off, like in terms of how goal oriented you are, your tolerance to stress? I don't know, like just like the way like you talk about the forward center of mass thing a lot, and kind of like your, I don't know, I think there's definitely a huge component of endocrine profile of, like men versus women and how it affects their neurology and who becomes driven in like a business entrepreneurial aspect. I'm sure there is some sort of literature to like support that you've probably found. Sure. I don't know if there's something you could touch on that, and then how like the TRT has affected your mental state because you're becoming more and more entrepreneurial oriented, I'm assuming, throughout your exposure to the social media stuff. Has the TRT influenced like your, goal setting or anything, or what have you found?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I think I when I was in graduate school, I was accused of being a OCD workaholic. Recently, I was also accused of being a OCD workaholic. I've always worked a lot. Okay. I've always worked a lot, and I enjoy work. I've always enjoyed work and working out. But also have great friendships and relationships. And, I wouldn't say that I've noticed a significant increase. I think there is one subjective effect, which is that I do think that it tends to create a little bit more of a buffer, meaning when stressful events occur, I think my immediate reaction to it is more one of just kind of noticing and calm and paying attention and being able to lean in with more of a focus, as opposed to feeling like I need to react in the moment. And so I think it's been, so that's kind of counterintuitive, right? One would think, oh, it makes people really reactive. I think it's actually allowed for a little bit more equanimity in general. But, when Robert Sapolsky, who wrote the book, The Trouble with Testosterone, and who's a luminary in the field of hormones and behavior, he worked for the great Bruce McEwen, who studied stress and hormones. And Robert is second to none in the stuff. When we talked about this, he said about hormones and their effects on psychology, he said, they tend to make people more of whatever they were before. And I think that's a pretty accurate assessment. Now, I do realize there are derivatives of testosterone, and you've talked about these on your podcast before, trenbolone and things like that can really activate aggression and have very robust psychological effects. Haven't gone anywhere near any of those, and I don't intend to. That's just too deep into the murky waters for someone like me who's health conscious and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think that, to me, hormones are such a powerful lever on life and organisms and their bodies, their minds, and also the interactions between organisms. And then it's just an infinitely fascinating area of our biology. As you may have noticed, I've been doing some posts recently about how, people there are good data of how people's sense of sweat from different people can impact notions of attractiveness. There's a whole literature on that. There's a whole literature on how the smell of women's sweat can cause testosterone increases in men. If women are taking oral contraception, then that effect tends to be blunted a little bit, this kind of thing. I mean, there's tons of literature in humans on this stuff. And, hormones are powerful. I mean, I don't need to tell you that. You're well aware. But I think that as people start to wade into the thinking about this, I just think these are not, these are major compounds of our health and well-being, but they also can be major compounds of our distress and sickness. So it's something to approach with a lot of caution.
The mention of like combined oral contraceptives and the effect that has, like, I've seen pretty significant detriment to total and free testosterone levels in women who are on them using synthetic progestins in concurrence with ethinyl estradiol as a like hyper aggressive estrogen receptor agonist to basically, castrate them, essentially, is what it's doing. That effect on their psychology and whatnot, and the effect it even has on like their preference of partners, it seems pretty glaring in the literature. What is, like, for me, I've always told, like, there's a lot of girls who use combined oral contraceptives still, and I've always told them, in the ideal scenario, if you're going to use something, go for like a copper IUD as opposed to like a progestin plus an ethinyl estradiol. Do you have any thoughts on like what would be for a female to maintain like peak physiology, like even from a body composition standpoint? Obviously crushing your free test by 60-70% is not ideal when you're using a levonorgestrel or a one of these other synthetic progestins in the standard birth control preparations. Is there anything, like, I guess obviously this is kind of just like a fucking sex ed question at this point, but I mean, is a copper IUD, you think, like the ideal formats to avoid hormonal exposure? Or do you think the hormonal exposure from some of these like localized like progesterone IUDs are like useful? Or what do you think about that in general?
Yeah, it's a really great and important question. I mean, I'm going to plead ignorance on this because right now I'm trying to find someone, an endocrinologist, who can provide really good answers about female hormone health. And I've narrowed the list down to a couple of people. It's been harder to find than you might have imagined. There nowadays a lot more information about testosterone.
Female hormones is like most people don't even understand the male system, let alone females, like next level shit.
Yeah. And I've identified a couple of people at major university research centers who are very thoughtful about this. So I'm not being cagey about it. I just, anything that I would say I'd be off in by a mile or more. But I look forward to getting somebody like that in a discussion, and I'll definitely bring you into that discussion, because I think that more and more I'm getting asked questions about PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, getting asked questions about contraception, getting asked questions about this, and it's it's really hard to get good answers out there.
Yeah. One thing maybe you'll find interesting, just a tidbit, is when I was looking into the combined oral contraceptives detriment to the hormone profile, like in general, like you're essentially inducing self-castration is like the whole point of it. Like you're using those progestins are derived from nandrolone, which that progestogenic feedback along with, the estrogen that you're using is what leads to the shutdown. But something that like DHEA is often looked at as a supplement, like, oh, it's a precursor to testosterone. Is that useful? And in men, they find like no performance enhancing benefit or raising of testosterone whatsoever. In women, they actually find in individuals who are using combined oral contraceptives, they can completely restore their total and free T to near baseline whilst maintaining their combined oral contraceptive routine. Like, it's so significant on their T levels, it's absolutely insane. So that might be
that's very interesting. Yeah, I overlooked. You reminded me that I overlooked to mention that I tried DHEA some years ago. Zero zip. No
Yeah,
effect.
yeah.
Actually, the only effect that it gave me was to make me feel kind of lousy. I didn't feel so,
It's weird because it's like in men, it's really strange how it works. I don't know if it's like it somehow changes the steroidogenesis cascade based on if you're like a female with low T versus a guy who has like normal T, but it seems to just basically convert to like goes down like the estrogen conversion pathway rather than, I don't know, like it doesn't seem to actually manifest in any like clinical like significant changes in T. But for women, it's like so dramatic and performance enhancing potentially too, that it's like definitely worth looking at. And individuals who are like dead set on remaining on their combined oral contraceptive, but don't like their free test being lowered by 70% or whatever, adding in like a minor dose of DHEA restores it to near baseline. Really crazy. Yeah.
Very, very interesting. Yeah, I got nothing from DHEA, but obviously, I probably because I don't have the right chromosomal arrangement.
Yeah, exactly. So the TRT thing, I think that's cool that you're actually, because a lot of people it's sort of like there's like the science side. A lot of times they're really like myopic about looking at literature, and then the bro science side, they're very myopic about looking at anecdotal feedback and just like inject yourself with the shit and see what happens. But it's nice to see somebody like yourself who not only has like the professional credentials, but also like the social media influence and like being like so open to doing the whole like coinciding like the bros sort of on like my side with like the real literature and like the actual like academics on this side, like actually experimenting with yourself before you start to like put out information to get like the whole cumulative picture of it. So it should be interesting.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I felt it was important. I mean, all the stuff I talk about, like ice baths, for instance, not holotropic, but tumo type breathing. I mean, years ago, 2016, I went over to Spain and spent some time with Wim Hof. It brought him to my lab. This was long before the social media stuff. The work with David Spiegel's lab and hypnosis. If I'm going to work on hormones in the laboratory and then I'm going to talk about it in terms of potential for public health, I want to have the experience of knowing what I'm talking about, literally, and the experience of it, and also and not in any reckless way, but to try and just ground the conversation. I mean, I think that obviously a formal, rigorous training and coursework has its value. So does real life experience. I think anyone who says one or the other is the only way to go is not thinking about the issue clearly. Now, people have careers and times and lives that don't allow for exploration of everything. And so ultimately what I'd like to do is serve as a bridge between communities, because I do think there are gems within the sports community and gems within the academic community and gems in all these different locations. And the idea is to kind of, move all these to the center and talk about them with folks like you and others, so that we can get to a place where people are thinking about this stuff rationally. I mean, again, like what you've brought forward about breaking up dosages, for instance, or not leaping into things without first getting blood work done. These are not minor points. These are critical points for anyone who's thinking about their health and performance.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, and I had to write this one down because it was something I didn't want to skim over, and I've thought of it like 5 times on this podcast, but I keep forgetting to bring it up. We were talking way at the beginning about prenatal exposure to androgens, and that was like one of the basis for one of your main subsections of research. And you mentioned on Rogan how estrogen exposure is what masculinizes the brain. I was wondering if you could delve into like how exactly that, like, I know, for example, like even firsthand, if I've used an aromatase inhibitor haphazardly to, like back in the day when it was the dogma was you need to use an aromatase inhibitor on cycle, you must be using it to get your estrogen as low as possible, because in men, estrogen is like the antithesis of masculinity, like high T, low estrogen. Like that's what you got to do for being like the most masculine person ever. But you find that you actually end up with erectile dysfunction, bone mineral degeneration, like all these things when you have low estrogen. But the actual like exposure to it in adolescence, like I was under the impression that DHT exposure is what ultimately leads to like sexual differentiation and like maturation of like penis development and things of that nature. So like I was just wondering if you could explain, just for my general curiosity, like how estrogen actually does that.
Yeah. Yes, so this is a literature I'm very familiar with. And you hit on a number of the key points. So there are what are called primary sexual characteristics and secondary sex characteristics. Primary sexual characteristics are typically the ones that occur prenatally in response to the androgen that's made by the fetus and or by the mom. Okay. And the reason I mentioned mom is that there are conditions of, like, for instance, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where the adrenals are cranking out loads of androgens, and the babies, female or male, are seeing that, and that has an impact, et cetera. But to make it a vast literature somewhat simpler, we can say for sure that dihydrotestosterone that is produced by the male fetus produces the development of the penis, and to some extent the masculinization of the male brain. Now, when I say masculinization, I want to be really clear what I mean. This is a phrase from reproductive and developmental endocrinology. I'm not saying this for politically correct reasons. I'm saying this just to be really clear, because unlike in online communities, in biology, we have real operational definitions of what we mean. So what ends up happening is there's an area of the brain called the medial preoptic area, which differs in the clusters of neurons that exist there, and the size of those clusters vary between people who have XY chromosomes and XX chromosomes. And that's because those with XY chromosomes will produce DHT, which creates a growth of this particular pocket of cells in the brain, growth of the penis. And also on the Y chromosome, you have what's called Mullerian inhibiting hormone. So it makes sure Mullerian ducts don't form, and fallopian tubes don't form. Rather, the Wolffian ducts form, the vas deferens forms, which of course brings, all sorts of important components to the penis and testes. So DHT is involved in masculinizing a good portion of the prenatal body and brain in individuals with Y chromosomes. However, the testosterone that's produced by the fetus has major effects in masculinizing certain elements of the brain of people with Y chromosomes. And here again, I'm not saying people with Y chromosomes to avoid saying male. I'm saying this because in a moment, I'll tell you where this can actually get confusing for certain individuals that are XY, but are born appearing female, which does happen. So DHT is responsible for some of the primary sexual characteristics, for sure. But testosterone that aromatizes into estrogen also has major effects in establishing these so-called sexually dimorphic pathways of the brain, meaning pathways in the brain that are present in one sex, males, and not in the others, or vice versa. Now, there is some critique of this recently that this is true in mice, but not in humans. Because in humans that don't have the gene for aromatase, but are XY, it doesn't seem as if there are any impairments in masculinization of the brain. However, there is this situation in genetics. You often hear of somebody who has a gene or doesn't have a gene, but there's this condition that we call a hypomorph. A hypomorph is somebody that has the gene, but they make very little of the particular gene product. And so that's an
individual that has like a mutation in the gene that encodes for aromatase, and then they just end up with total estrogen deprivation the entirety of their lives if they don't supplement with exogenous estrogen. Is that?
There are people that have very, very, very little estrogen. I mean, there are other sources of estrogen in the male body besides testosterone aromatized into estrogen, but they are, body fat, for instance, can churn out some estrogen, but not a ton.
So do those individuals end up with like cardiovascular disease and neurodegeneration if they don't use exogenous E2?
They can have issues. I don't know whether or not that's it. You would predict that. I'll just say that your prediction is spot on with the biochemistry, but whether or not that hasn't really been explored.
Sorry, I just get interested on side tangents as you're going.
No, but it's an important point that you're making, because the point that you're making is directly in line with this larger theme that estrogen is critical for cardiovascular health, and that's something that's relevant to everybody, male or female, and regardless of hormone levels. So it's fascinating. And you ask, well, why would aromatized estrogen be responsible for masculinizing certain circuits within the brain? Why would that be? Well, it has to do with these long, slow effects of steroid hormones. as you know, there are fast effects and there are slow effects. And some of them, when I say fast, I don't mean within seconds or minutes, but they're within a day or two of a spike in testosterone. There are noticeable effects on psychology, et cetera. But then there are the gene expression effects. So as you know, but just for your audience, steroid hormones, because they're essentially lipid soluble, they can pass through the double layered membrane of a cell, but they can also go into what's called the nuclear envelope, which is where the DNA of the cell is housed. So this is amazing, right? Most compounds will bind to a receptor on a cell surface, like dopamine will bind to a cell surface and then or cell surface receptor, and then it has these so-called G protein coupled pathways, and it's sort of like all the dominoes fall, and then it has an effect. Other things will bind and have a much faster effect. Steroid hormones can actually pass into cells and go into the nucleus and change which genes those cells will express by controlling what are called transcription factors. And transcription factors are essentially like a menu of genes that will then, and proteins that will be expressed. So the way that testosterone, which is converted into estrogen through aromatase, masculinizes the male brain, air quotes, because it doesn't like make the fetus like talk with a deeper voice or something yet. Yeah. What it does is it sets up the circuit so that later, that when that child is born and is prepubertal, all of that is lying quiescent, as we say, waiting. All those circuits in the brain, some of them are active, right? There are differences. There are reported sex differences between boys and girls. There are reported hormone differences between boys and girls. But then when puberty happens, and the hypothalamus releases the pituitary to allow the pituitary to signal the gonads, well, then testosterone hits the system, and then those circuits in the brain are allowed to be activated by testosterone directly. Yeah. So it's an interesting twist, and it's often surprising. And I think whereas in females, right, the estrogen is acting, there's a different pathway that ensures that masculinization of these circuits does not occur. And that's through a completely different and somewhat more convoluted biochemical pathway. But it's really amazing, because what it means is that the brain is sort of getting set up by hormones and set to be ready and then activated. And the case that really illustrates this the most dramatically is in XY individuals who have a mutation in 5-alpha reductase. This was actually the way that 5-alpha reductase was discovered.
Yeah, the pseudohermaphrodites, right?
Yeah. So these are individuals that lack 5-alpha reductase, of course, the enzyme that converts testosterone into dihydrotestosterone, excuse me. And as we mentioned before, dihydrotestosterone is responsible for growth of the penis and some of the masculinizing effects on the fetal brain. So what happens is these individuals who have this mutation, which is quite common in certain areas, I believe of the Dominican Republic. There's some individuals, there's another pocket of individuals elsewhere. It's a familial genetic thing. These babies come into the world and they either have what looks to be like an enlarged clitoris or a standard female genitalia. And then what happens is, around the time of puberty, the testes start releasing testosterone, and there are some direct effects of testosterone on the growth of that tissue, which is actually what the name is kind of doesn't sound great. It's a vestigial penis, as they call it. It's just basically, it's not a clitoris. That's more common, the street name. And then it grows, and so they literally sprout what appears to be a penis. And the outcomes for these individuals in terms of what they select is quite interesting. Culturally this is known. And so some of them choose to go on to live as men. Others choose to have a gender reassignment surgery. Others don't. It's kind of varied, and it probably depends a lot on the social conditions, but also on what they're thinking about, their neural structures too. So it's fascinating. And I think brings us back to something we talked about way back at the beginning, which is that, how you or me or any individual reacts to a hormone therapy or a deficit of a hormone of any kind, in many ways will be reflective of a lot of developmental events that took place long before we were born. And it's not just, this is a case where we can truly just say it's not just people with XX or XY. And actually, there are people who have double X chromosome, double XY. There are people that have XYY, We've discovered now that there are many different chromosomal arrangements of this kind. But what that means is that how one person reacts to something and another in terms of hormone treatment differs, because some people have certain machineries there and other people have less or more of it. So it's fascinating.
Yeah, I've actually seen in like twins where one has the gene mutation that encodes for 5AR deficiency, or a lack of 5AR development, I should say. They end up like with no temporal recession of their hairline, and in some cases more muscular than their twin brother counterparts that don't have a deficiency. And it's like, as a consequence of the lack of 5-alpha reduction, they have more testosterone remaining as test to agonize the AR and cause, muscle protein synthesis, presumably, because DHT is essentially like inactivated, I guess, in skeletal muscle, where it's not as potent of a like protein accretion tool for actually building contractile tissue than testosterone is. So they end up more hair and more jacked than their brother, but they have a micro penis. Like, it's kind of weird that, like, what I've seen, but
interesting. So, I when I was a postdoc, which is again like this residency, my postdoc advisor was a very interesting guy. Unfortunately, he passed away for other reasons related to what I'll tell you in a moment. But he was born female, identical twin, which is really interesting. Identical twin sister. Their mother had been treated with a anti-miscarriage drug during pregnancy. Presumably they had seen different levels of this drug. So he was born female. From a very early age, prior to puberty, he reported not feeling as if he was in the right body. And he eventually had gender reassignment surgery. He was a close friend and a colleague, and he was obviously taking TRT. So female to male transition. He was one of the people that because I knew him quite well, a brilliant guy, absolutely brilliant. But he was the one who, because he was taking andro cream. And he was one of the people who initially told me, he said, the testosterone therapy had a number of powerful psychological effects for him, in one of the, not the least of which was that it made him want to work more and more and more. And this was this kind of effort feels good thing. And he reported very fast effects of that, probably because his system hadn't seen much androgen. So he would experience, like, within minutes of putting on the andro cream, maybe it was placebo effect, right? But he would he would report a kind of a lift in energy and drive and focus. So it's interesting. And I think that if we were to look with neuroimaging, we would probably find that there's a range of brain phenotypes depending on how much androgen people had seen in utero.
Yeah. I've actually seen certain cases of like certain individuals. There's like a community called it's called like PE, like penis enhancement, and these individuals will use things like water filled pumps and like stretching devices and stuff to try and stretch out the the ligament that attaches their penis to their body, essentially, and create like vascular kind of like engorgement to increase their width as well as their length. But individuals who were like androgen deprived in their youth and otherwise had micro penises, when they expose themselves to like DHT cream or something like that, they had like significant increases from the total androgen deprivation, where they basically went through like self-induced puberty. So not only did they have, the gains from whatever like mechanical stuff they were doing, but the androgen exposure, they would gain like 2 to 3 inches on their penis size just by kind of like putting themselves into the environment that they otherwise missed out on during adolescence, which I thought that was interesting, how it could kind of like happen later after oftentimes I think people think the closure of like the epiphyseal plates automatically equates to nothing can happen from a growth aspect at this point. But maybe that's more like structurally from a skeletal aspect. But I mean, even from like a penis growth aspect, it's kind of shocking to see individuals in their like adulthood, like growing, like missing their kind of like teenagehood, being able to like make up for it with androgen exposure. So I don't know, interesting point.
It's fascinating. I mean, yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, having spent a long portion of my career working on so-called critical periods where the brain is very plastic. And then this idea is that those critical periods shut. We now know that the brain is plastic throughout the entire lifespan, but the conditions for that plasticity just change. And I think that what you're describing is a sort of a hormone-induced tissue plasticity. There's also the experiment that we've seen many times, and I think you've done some posts on this, where somebody's head looks completely different. This head looks completely different from 2 years earlier. Maybe they're doing the jazzercise, maybe they're training their neck, maybe they're doing all sorts of things and had plastic surgery, but oftentimes it's because they're taking growth hormone and they look like a different human being. And so we are growing all the time. I mean, also our ears grow our entire lifespan. Our nose grows our entire lifespan. This is why in very old people, they have big ears. And it's a real thing.
Yeah. Have you heard of the experiment that teenagers are doing? Well, not a lot of them, but some of them are doing now, where they're using, this is like a makeshift, like get taller / bigger dick protocol, essentially. And they're using aromatase inhibitors to prevent epiphyseal plate closure, which then allows them to get taller potentially. They're using growth hormone concurrently with the aromatase inhibition component to enhance like stature overall. And then they're also using DHT exposure to grow their penises like as much as they can during. So they have like this, basically they've like eliminated the rate limiting step by which they stop puberty of like their, skeletal infrastructure. And they're trying to like concurrently grow their organ down here and get as tall as possible simultaneously. And it's sort of like a byproduct of some of the literature on like, dwarfs and stuff like that. But it's crazy, some of the biohacking stuff people are doing nowadays.
Yeah, I had not heard that. I mean, so when I hear stuff like that, I have to take a dual response on. I mean, that part of me just thinks, whoa, I don't think anyone should be cowboying their endocrinology without a physician. And then the other part of me, which is more of a, it's also part of me, but I sort of raise this flag of compassion too, where I have to assume that while there might be a subset of individuals who are doing this just to kind of see what happens, I have to imagine that a number of people are doing this because they're feeling a real need to do this from some sense of lack or, and so here's what I think would be great is in the next 5 or 10 years that hormone clinics can start to evolve to the place where it isn't like you can get whatever you want or do whatever you want, but that there's a thoughtful discussion about how to do things safely, right? Yeah. That's really what it's about, right? It's really about how can people achieve their health and lifestyle goals in a way that's really safe, because we can look to the extremes, bodybuilders who died extremely young from diuretics or androgen abuse. We can look to, you can look at, the most deadly mental health condition of all. As surprised to learn this, but it's absolutely true. The most deadly mental health condition is anorexia bulimia, anorexia nervosa, bulimia in a short second place. 1 in 5 people with anorexia die or commit suicide. And so it's like, this is like, those numbers are incredible and in the terrible sense of the word. And so I think that if people are exploring hormone augmentation for various purposes, I think that they need to do it safely, because these things have these slow, fast, and long-term effects. And so I have to imagine if people are doing this, it's because they feel a kind of desperate need to change something, obviously. And I just think that physicians who really can work with them is the solution. Right.
Yeah. What do you think about, there's a lot of teenagers getting into anabolics at a younger age now based on, influence of social media. They want to look like their, idol who's in their late 20s and has developed their physique over a span of multiple years of androgen, abuse or whatever. Some of these individuals are not just using like testosterone, which at least, it's bioidentical. You would sort of know what to predict from what happens to test exposure. Not that I would condone it, but using things like heavily psychoactive drugs like trenbolone, which like you can see what happens in like, rodents when they expose themselves to these compounds, and you can sort of extrapolate for humans. But do you think, like from a neuroplasticity aspect, do you think there is risk of permanent psychological changes from exposure to these compounds, even though they're like neuroplasticity is like peaked sort of thing, or they're more able to. Okay. Yeah,
I do. And I want to say again, I do. And I'm not just saying that wearing my hat as a university professor. I'm saying that because I just think if you think about what is the probability that they're going to have a career that is enhanced by this, what is the probability that, if anything, it's probably going to interfere with their ability to succeed in any other kind of job or endeavor.
Yeah.
Relationship to self, also an important relationship. I mean, it's absolute, to me, it's absolutely dreadful. And I think it's a terrible idea. What is important to address, however, is the why question. Why do they feel compelled to do this? Is it simply availability? Is it that the ideal that they're trying to achieve, saran wrapped skin and 3% body fat? Is it that they think that's being presented to them as the healthy ideal? Those questions are also really important. So to be really clear, I think it's terrible. I personally don't think anyone should, unless there's a real clinical need, I don't think anyone should touch hormone therapies for sake of performance enhancement until they've well past, childhood and puberty and into adulthood. And even then, I'm not so sure it's a great idea. I did one episode, I'll do another one, but on testosterone and estrogen optimization for my podcast. And I learned that there are male individuals in their 70s and 80s who maintain pretty respectable testosterone levels. These are people who are physically active, take really good care of themselves. Yes, there's a genetic component, but they do the work. And so when I hear that teenagers and even people in their 20s are getting into these, especially the more dangerous varieties of these testosterone augmentation, I really worry. It's not me being hyper reactive. I really genuinely worry, and I just say no. Like, it's just like and I know a lot of people will like roll their eyes and say, oh, you don't know what I'm dealing with. And that's true too. I also don't know what they're dealing with. I don't have any concept of what it's like to be them. And that I admit that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy how like the ideal male physique, or like it's so paradoxical that the fitness industry is like the least healthy industry because it's plagued by the most like hormone abuse of all. And frankly, a lot of like bad diet habits that, reinforce like eating disorders and stuff. Like in the fitness industry,
Yeah. Well, and where this really went off the rails was a few years ago when it wasn't. So, the fitness industry has always had these individuals. Like if you look at the old muscle and fitness magazines that the Weeders put out there, I mean, all those physiques were unrealistic, clearly drug assisted, 98% of them. And we could do natty or nots on all the rest. But that's, so the point is that the fitness industry has always been driving that a little bit, but the movie industry is what really exacerbated this increase, because what you saw were movie actors and action heroes who took on, sort of action figure type physiques. And these are individuals that are considered the what we call them celebrities for a reason, because they're celebrated, right? Yeah. And so it's actually the fault of the entertainment industry to present that imagery, because you and I both know that with very rare exceptions, when we see somebody who's getting really, really lean and big for a role, of course they're assisted. And I know firsthand that peptide use is rampant in Hollywood right now. Yeah. And so, I mean, that's the men and women. And so that's actually the biggest concern for me. The fitness industry has always been one that was a little bit niche. But now it's the movie industry has really shifted this. And you're seeing this with plastic surgery, mostly in females, lip augmentation in young people. I mean, this is terrible. This is really terrible. And so I think the movie industry needs to check itself on this one.
No, yeah, I think a lot of the like even the physiques now that the youth are seeing that are inspiring them to use anabolics at too young of an age, the original people who those young people are aspiring to look like are individuals who originally were inspired themselves by the Arnolds, by the, you know, those individuals who otherwise basically built their entire livelihood and like fame off of the back of like anabolic steroid use, frankly. Like, would Arnold be who he was if he didn't use gear? Like, probably not.
No. I saw him the other day. He looks great. He's training hard and looks healthy, but he clearly has understood how to keep things in a healthy range for him.
Right? Oh yeah. Now he's obviously, you know, responsible about what he's doing hormone wise, but like back in his heyday, you know, would he have gotten any of those roles or become Mr. Olympia or any of that stuff without the anabolics? And ultimately that's like the idol that a lot of these guys have. Like, yeah.
Well, and football and dare I say basketball. I mean, anyone who watches the major sports leagues and thinks that there isn't hormone assistance there. Some sports and some individuals, no, it's clear they're not. But it's so at this point, it's just so interwoven with the lifestyle that they live, which is training all the time and the demands that are on them.
Yeah.
It's absolutely clear. I mean, I know and work with a number of these people, and you know, and they are able to do it, but that doesn't mean that the typical person, the office worker, the student, et cetera, should consider leaning into this. And I'm quite forthcoming about the fact that I went nowhere near it, right? 45 years. You know, so, and I'm not genetically gifted to be anything, right? I just, you know, hard work, they call it hard work for a reason. It's hard, it's painful, you know, but it's good for you.
One thing we definitely should touch on before we close it out is so I had some general questions on, like, you've talked about before, of eating disorders, as well as, you know, like appetite management and kind of like different strategies from a neurological side of things, and kind of like the actual neurotransmitters involved with, you know, cravings and whatnot and addiction. One thing, you had a podcast with Mark Bell recently, and I'll put in the chat box here the link to he actually made an Instagram post about it, and it's actually the pinned comment right now on the full podcast on the YouTube video, is Greg Doucette, I guess, interpreted what you were saying as you not understanding what calories in versus calories out is. And I'll quote his comment here, and I'll have my editor overlay the comment on the screen. He says, as soon as someone says calories in, calories out doesn't work, do you know they have zero, like, I'll just, you know, paraphrase based on what I think he's trying to say here. Work, you know that they have zero credibility no matter how good they are and everything else. If he's not smart enough to know that the calories out portion can be adjusted with hormones, and therefore calories in, calories out always works, then what can you actually trust from this person? So, like, I can't imagine that, like, there wasn't obvious context, I would think, to what you were saying in that discussion. And I can't imagine you don't know what calories in, calories out is, or how, like, the laws of thermodynamics work. So I was just hoping to give you a platform potentially to kind of like rebut that statement, because, you know, the thing's pinned, and like, it's not like you could have gone back and say, actually, this is what I meant, or whatever, if it got misinterpreted. So I just want to give you the floor to react to that if you wanted to touch on it.
Oh yeah, sure. So I think that there's a deficit of comprehension there, meaning I think so to be very clear, I did an entire podcast about nutrition and metabolism, and I think, as I understand it, and I certainly believe that calories ingested versus calories metabolized, aka calories in versus calories out, absolutely is foundational to whether or not one loses, maintains, or gains body weight. There's no question. I don't think but I mean, if anyone, I mean, the earth is round, and calories in, calories out is a fundamental law of how the body works. However, there are influences on the calories out portion that include not just exercise, how much your brain uses, basal metabolic rate, et cetera, will be impacted by hormones. Of course, thyroid hormone being one of the most obvious ones, right? also cortisol, also growth hormone, also testosterone, also estrogen. So I think that whoever said that was it misunderstood what I was saying. Calories in, calories out certainly is vital and foundational. Hormones impact that equation, as does exercise, as does a number of other factors. So this sounds to me like I said, it sounds like a misunderstanding where they thought I was saying one thing, and then I'm not sure I understood their comment. I did read their comment, but I somehow I couldn't understand their comment. But it was clear.
Greg does he does talk to text, so it ends up being like not representative probably of exactly what he would have said in person, but presumably he thinks, like he got his point across that, I don't know, like the calories in, calories out thing, like it's one of his main topics he really like owns in on, and anyone who kind of like questions it, like I guess justifiably, he's sort of like, I don't know, like rebuts their stance. But I don't think that's what you were trying to say at all at the end of the day.
No, clearly. So I'll say he agrees with me about calories in, calories out, and vice versa. I mean, I think that, and I'm sort of perplexed here because I'd never said that anything different. It's that, and we did an entire podcast episode on this. I think that right now there's an interesting situation that's happening in terms of online nutrition and fitness information. You see this also with the carnivore diet versus vegan diet versus, I mean, it's almost like nowadays to be an omnivore is kind of an act of defiance or something like that. Right?
Yeah.
But I happen to be an omnivore. Okay. So first of all, to each their own. I think that people should do what they feel is ethically and health, and from an ethical and health related perspective is best for them. But I think that what's happened is that, especially in terms of nutrition, because there are a few individuals out there who are pointing to the fact that there are elements related to food quality and type that are relevant, people from the calories in, calories out stance, of which I consider myself one also, but many people are sort of pointing to them and saying they're trying to emphasize the wrong things. Now, one of the more powerful things I think people should realize is this notion of food quality and highly palatable foods is relevant. So food, calories in, calories out is been known for centuries, but is best supported by, I think, in a formal way by a study that was done by a colleague of mine at Stanford named Chris Gardner, where they compared ketogenic, high carb, low fat diets and other types of diets over a very long period of time in hundreds of individuals, and saw that it did not matter how you got your macronutrients. As long as you were in a caloric deficit, you lost weight. So there it is, calories in, calories out. Mm-hmm. Now, Robert Lustig, who's an MD, Dr. Robert Lustig, an endocrinologist actually at University of California, San Francisco, has talked a lot about how hidden sugars and food emulsifiers and highly palatable foods are creating changes in the mucosa of the gut lining and causing changes in the neurons that innervate the gut that then go and impact brain centers that impact appetite. And this is work from him, but also work from a guy at Duke named Diego Borges and others. So what we've got here is a situation where everyone agrees how much you eat matters. Everyone agrees that how much you burn depends on a number of important factors. But then there's this additional camp that's kind of raising its arm saying, wait, this food is good and this food is bad, and this food is good and this food is bad. And that's where a lot of the battle comes to, because here's why. Most studies of nutrition only can look objectively at weight loss or one factor like cardiovascular factor. Maybe they look at cortisol too, maybe some cardiovascular factor. Maybe they look at cortisol also. So the problem is people are arguing about different things. They're not even arguing about the same thing. And it gives the illusion that there's actually a controversy. So if Lane Norton says calories in, calories out works and you can eat carbohydrates, he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. And he can get himself and his clients good results with that. It's absolutely true that intermittent fasting can work for certain people. And I think he would agree also. So I think that the funny part, the irony is that I think people agree much more than they're willing to let on. It's that right now people are clamoring for the position of authority. And so what people have forgotten is that there is a situation that exists in science that I'd like to see more of in the online community, which is a lot more like this, Derek, where we can all contribute things of value, provided that we know that if we're arguing about the same thing and that we're hearing each other correctly. The problem is right now there's much more incentive in the online version of things to pretend that you heard what you wanted to hear so that it gives you a lot more to say.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying you, but that and actually all that's doing is it's creating this kind of down spiraling echo chamber. And I predict that in the next couple of years, what's going to happen is that the people that are really able to parse things and talk about things in a segmented way and say, let's get really precise about what we're talking about, maybe even arguing about, then it's going to get interesting. And I have to say, that's what I've experienced in this conversation with you. We haven't argued at all, but you and I disagree about some things. I'm sure there are many things we disagree on. But the point is that I know that I can learn from you, and hopefully you feel as if you can learn from me. And then we try and arrive at a consensus by making sure that when we're misunderstanding or disagreeing each other, that we're misunderstanding and disagreeing about the same issue. Because right now, a lot of things out there are like this. And I see that all over social media, and it's wasting everybody's time. We could all be doing much better things.
Yeah. I think the whole idea gets convoluted with like food quality, like you said as well, like the calories in, calories out thing. No one's disputing that. But I think anyone with a brain would say that if you're comparing a guy eating 3,000 calories of Oreos every day versus a guy who's eating 3,000 calories of high quality red meat, organ meats, I don't know, like a balanced diet with vegetables, fruit, etc., the individual with the balanced diet model and like adequate protein and adequate micronutrients and everything is going to have superior thyroid function, superior endocrine parameters, superior muscle preservation, etc., and end up with a totally different body composition than the 3,000 calorie of Oreo guy. And maybe their fat loss outcomes are going to be different as a result of that. I think that is like but I don't think anyone would argue against that, but somehow it makes like an argument out of nothing, like right. When this conversation comes up a lot of the time. Yeah,
I think that the one way to think about it that might be useful for people is so when somebody says something that you agree with or that agrees with you, it doesn't lead to a next step usually. So for instance, if I see something online and I'm in full agreement with it and it's great, I'll say terrific, love it, but it stops there. Whereas when you see something that you disagree with, there's a whole opportunity to do I totally disagree rebuttal to it unilaterally without any input from the other person. Now in science, the way science progresses is actually by doing that. You see things that you disagree with or that you're skeptical of, but the difference is inside of the scientific community, two things are different. One is that if you're going to make an argument that contradicts somebody else's argument, you have to start with a clear understanding of what they said, and two, you have to make sure that what you present something new instead, and that's critical. And then the other element that is in science, we are all judging each other publicly and privately, and we impact each other's career. We review each other's papers, we review each other's grants. We very much control each other's careers, and so we all work together while at the same time that we all argue like crazy to try and get to a better place. Uh-huh. And what I'd love to see in the the online community would be more of that, more panels of discussion. But instead, many of the platforms have been built around being somebody who ardently proposes blank, and most of their career now is becoming about pointing out everyone that disagrees with them. And that actually, when I say it's the down spiraling pattern, what that does is, we've seen this in science, we see this in every business endeavor. If your primary function is pointing out where other people are wrong, as opposed to presenting new ideas of truth and ideas, what ends up happening is those people disappear over time. So I really worry that people who are so passionate about health and fitness, and if they're not continually bringing forward new information, and their major role is to kind of bark and hiss and whine about the things that disagree with them, the problem is they're actually sinking below water. They don't realize it, but they're sinking below water because they're essentially not offering anything new. They're not adding new information. They're just crying about the information they don't like. So again, one reason why I appreciate what you do, there are others too, of course, that are out there really trying hard to create very finely parsed information, really drill into the specifics and the issues. That's what we need more of, and that's what people really benefit from.
Yeah. I would be remiss if I didn't ask about your personal diet before we finish the conversation, though, because I think a lot of people, they hold you in high regard for like optimal practices and kind of like what you deem to be the best modalities of improving like mental clarity, sharpness through like actual lifestyle modifications, dietary manipulation, sleep hygiene, etc. So like through your trials and tribulations of experimenting with different things, some people, they use keto to like stay mentally sharp. Maybe it's not sustainable long term, and they intertwine like cyclical carbohydrate cycling or whatever. A lot of people intermittent fast. Like for me personally, I find if I eat a carbohydrate dense meal right when I wake up, personally, my mental clarity suffers a decent amount. Like, is there something you've nailed down as like your ideal kind of like routine, and like what do those foods generally consist of? And this is probably like maybe this is way too many questions for one big statement, but hopefully it's not. Have you done anything to assess, like, do you hold any weight in those kind of like tests that assess your allergy response to food groups to assess if they're going to be good on your mental state? Or do you do just like biofeedback through trial and error sort of thing?
Yeah, trial and error. I'm not a big believer in gut microbiome testing for myself. So I think I found a diet that works well for me. Obviously, it will be different for different people, but this is what allows me to be consistent about eating quality foods. One thing I'll note before I say this, one very dramatic effect of taking this, what I would say is a pretty low dose of TRT since the new year, is absolutely zero appetite for sugar or for any foods that you would consider junk or processed food.
Lucky.
Almost negative appetite, but I've always enjoyed fatty foods as an indulgence more than sugary. But so over the years, I've tried many different nutritional plans and been very regimented about them and took notes. I'll just give you a kind of a highlight of a few, and then why I didn't stick with them, and then emphasize what I'm doing now. So when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I did try a kind of a high fat, very low carbohydrate thing. I was like drinking half and half and eating meat, and I did grow quite a lot on that. But it was, of course, I was 19 years old. I was also training heavy. I was completely natural, but I was also probably in the peak. I'm guessing my androgen levels were probably taken off. And I am somewhat of a fast responder in terms of when I weight train, I grow quickly. Also, when I stop weight training or I run, I shrink quickly. So, it cuts both ways. I did a few years ago, I tried keto, including taking liquid ketone esters. And I got psoriasis on my scalp that was unbelievable. It was like my scalp sloughing off. It was terrible. I stopped the ketone esters. I put carbohydrates back in my diet, and it went away within a week. So who knows? I was told I did it wrong, and I probably did it wrong, but it shouldn't be that complicated. Is my
no. Yeah. Was it just like the same foods you would normally eat, but like you pulled the carbohydrates and then increase the quantities of the other stuff that you were already tolerating normally?
Yeah, a little more fat. And the only thing I added were those ketone esters, which were interesting in their own right. But so what I've done for years, it's funny. I actually, maybe at some time I'll put this online. I've taken careful notes. I have a folder right next to me here where I essentially have my nutrition has been very consistent for 10 or 15 years. And I should just say, I'm not particularly lean, nor am I carrying a lot of excess body fat. I think I'm pretty average in that sense. I don't know, somewhere around 12% or something. I haven't measured in a long time. But basically for the last 10 years, I've fasted anywhere from 12 to 16 hours for every 24-hour cycle. So I knew Sachin when he was formulating intermittent fasting, time restricted eating, and his book and his science was coming out. I also got to know Ori Hofmeckler, who wrote the book The Warrior Diet. He's kind of the originator of the 1 meal a day system. Ori was in Israeli special forces, really nice guy. He's in his probably early 60s now. he still maintains 5% body fat. He's very fit, very, very nice guy. Actually, he doesn't get enough credit for being the kind of modern founder of intermittent fasting, because it's been existed for centuries, of course. But so basically, I get up, I hydrate, I drink some caffeine. I do delay my caffeine by about 90 minutes to 2 hours after waking, because it does seem to avoid a crash later. Coffee, yerba mate, that kind of thing. But then I do drink Athletic Greens, even though they are a podcast sponsor. I do love Athletic Greens. I've been drinking that stuff for ages, gosh, since 2012. And I do love it. Then my first meal is almost always a low carb meal. It's some steak or ground beef, some Brazil nuts, maybe a vegetable, but I do have more mental clarity when I'm low carbohydrate, provided that my glycogen stores have been repacked from the previous day or so. So I'll typically train late morning. If I train really hard, if it's resistance training, then I'll have, a bowl of rice or a bowl of oatmeal or something. And I like butter, so I'll put a pat of butter in there, and my blood lipid profiles are just fine. I think there's an entire YouTube video sort of analyzing and scrutinizing that I said that I like butter. I don't walk around eating on sticks of butter. Well, again, it's like my first impulse when I saw it was first I laughed, and then I thought, wow, do they really think that I live on that much butter? Small amounts of butter. But then what I realized, I was like, well, this is really sad. Like they don't really have anything else to talk about besides the fact that I eat butter. But in any case, a low carbohydrate meal in the midday for me is best, because then I don't get that dip, that crash. A mental clarity comes easy.
So you would be sleeping for 8 hours until roughly 5:30 to 6 a.m., right? And then you wouldn't eat for another 6 to 8 hours, and then you'd start eating.
About 6 hours. Yeah, okay. But if I get up and I do put a little salt in my water, because sometimes the appetite can be, sometimes you think you're hungry, but if you put some salt and lemon juice in water, you drink that, then you notice, I'm not hungry anymore. And you were probably sodium deficient. Okay. A lot of people who do low carb diets are sodium deficient. So I sort of fast until about noon, then I eat a low carb meal. I make sure it's not a huge meal, but I go by appetite. Sometimes that's 2 hamburger patties and some, maybe I'll eat a cucumber, or sometimes I'll have a bowl of oatmeal, but rarely, right? I'm not super strict about that. If I've trained, I will include carbohydrates and some fruit with that meal too. And then in the afternoon, I tend to just hydrate. I might have some almonds, Athletic Greens, maybe. Sometimes I'll have some whey protein or something of that sort. And then for dinner, for years now, I've really emphasized starches. I'll have pasta, salad, sometimes a little bit of fish, like tuna fish or salmon, but mostly carbohydrates. And then I sleep like a baby. And I go to sleep sometime around 10:30, 11, and I sleep great. And when I've cut the carbohydrates out, 2 things happen. One, I wake up and if I feel like I can train, my endurance, even within weight training, is not that strong. And then I'm hungrier much earlier. The other is, if I eat too much meat close to bedtime, I don't sleep that well. And probably because the gastric clearance time is too long. I do try and take a walk before or after dinner. Today I did it before. So there are evenings where I'm eating these, a bowl of pasta or a bunch of rice and salad. And I think to myself, just because the mindset is, I need protein. And sometimes I'll have some, but I'm eating sometimes a ribeye for lunch and scoops of protein powder. Now I will say, if I'm training, like the other day I trained hard, I'm using your EAAs now, which I like very much. Awesome. And your post-workout. And no, folks, I did not get paid to say that. I purchased these supplements. So so I do take that afterwards, and again, fruit and starch. So for me, it's really fast, train toward the end of that fast, eat. If I've trained, eat some carbohydrates and some clean protein. And then towards the afternoon, I might have a little something else in the afternoon that is also kind of low carb-ish. And then in the evening, I eat my carbohydrates in it. They're not huge bowls of pasta, and I wake up feeling really good. I think my glycogen's restored and I'm ready to go. Occasionally, if I'm not training much, I'll drop the carbohydrate meal to about half the size, but I don't weigh my food. I don't do any of that. And for me, this has worked for a very long period of time. And yes, there are days where I get up and have 4 eggs for breakfast at 8 a.m. Yeah, it happens. So if you ever see me eating 4 eggs for breakfast at 8 a.m. at a cafe, whoever you are, don't cry foul. I do this from time to time. But yeah, that's pretty much it. And then it's the typical stuff. It's like tomatoes, avocados, broccoli, spinach, olive oils, fish oil. I'm big on fish oil for all the health benefits. And I've been doing this for 30 plus years, pretty much.
How many grams of fish oil do you have per day?
So I am a big believer, based on really good data, that peer-reviewed data, that you want to get 2 grams of EPA in your system every day for the antidepressant effects, the blood lipid profile effects, it seems to me that it's obvious that sufficiently high EPAs are just good for us.
Yeah.
And that not having sufficiently high EPAs is bad for us. And so, since I don't eat a lot of fatty fish, because I'm not terribly fond of the taste of fish anyway, especially on the West Coast, I think on the East Coast and in Canada, I think you get better seafood. But here, I don't know, on the West Coast, it's like the salmon, it isn't always that great. So I think fish oil is terrific.
All right. So that to get that 2 gram EPA yield, how much actual fish oil are you having though? Is it like 4 or 5 grams or something, or?
Yeah, so it's a couple capsules of the Thorne Super EPA, and usually I also this might make some people cringe, but I actually will put a tablespoon of the Carlson's fish oil, the lemon flavored fish oil, on my oatmeal. Well, on my oatmeal with salt, and to me it tastes delicious. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sure that sounds decent.
Yeah, and just for skin health and quality, and just for mental health and feelings of well-being. I get the probiotics from the Athletic Greens. I used to supplement with capsule probiotics. Mm-hmm. 2 reasons why I don't do that anymore. One, even though I can afford them, that they are sort of ridiculously expensive for what they are. That's one. More importantly, my colleague Justin Sonnenberg and his wife Erica Sonnenberg, in the right upstairs from me at Stanford, have published data showing that 2 to 4 servings of fermented foods each day, low sugar fermented foods like kimchi, sauerkraut, natto, things of that sort, greatly decrease the number of inflammatory markers in the so-called inflammatome, which is the kind of Gyno, but the inflammatory markers, IL-6 and other things of that sort, TNF alpha. And it's not clear also that the over-the-counter antibiotic capsules don't seem to replace the correct gut microbiome elements. And there is some reports of them creating brain fog and making people feel kind of foggy when you have too much activity of microbiota in your gut. So, that's why
it seems like a lot of them are just like randomly selected strains with no real like clinical, like reinforcing literature at all.
Yeah. And lactobacillus, so that there are a few that, and I'm probably getting some of these names wrong, so maybe let me retract that statement about lactobacilli. You can keep it in here, but I have a podcast coming up that looks at time-restricted feeding, and it turns out that some probiotics can create some mental effects that aren't great. Other gut microbiota are really terrific, and so the ones that come in capsule form, I think just hit it with it's like a shotgun approach. Whereas fermented foods, especially fermented foods that are slightly acidic, so things like fresh sauerkraut, natto, fresh pickles, this kind of thing. I mean, pickles can't really be fresh. It's kind of an oxymoron, but you know what I mean. Not jars of pickles that have been sitting around non-refrigerated for very long periods of time, but the ones that require refrigeration. They maintain a lot of elements that can contribute to a healthy gut microbiome. And the work coming out of Duke University, a nutritionist and neuroscientist, Diego Borges, keep an eye out for his work. We should kick back and forth some of his papers, Derek, because he's doing amazing work showing how there are neurons in the gut that trigger dopamine release in the brain, and that set up a whole situation in your body of rapid healing. And this is what I think the origins of GPC 157 are, which is that gastric peptides, if they're provided, the gastric juices are of the right chemistry, can actually facilitate healing all over the body. Sort of a tangential statement, but it relates.
Okay. Speaking of Thorne, do you use their Elite multivitamin by chance, or what do you feel like about multivitamins in general?
Yeah. Here so I don't use their multivitamin. I use
Do
their
you have like
fish oil.
a stance on like multivitamins in general?
Yeah. So I do take one each day. And the one I take, this is really funny. This just goes to show you that we develop these habits and they're hard to change over time. So many years ago, I bought a canister of the Optimen.
Okay.
And I've been taking that vitamin for something like 25 years. I just take one with the one full meal I have each day. And I don't, to be honest, at this point, it's like, it's rational only in the sense that it's never caused me a problem. But I do notice if I take B vitamins and it's rich in B vitamins that you metabolize your food more quickly. This is clear to me.
Okay. Yeah, I use the Thorne multivitamin like Elite, but I'm always interested to hear individuals' opinions on if multivitamins are potentially counterproductive or not, because some people have differing stances on that.
Yeah, I don't, because I get my blood work done, I'm not too worried about buildup of fat soluble vitamins and things. I take a little bit of vitamin E from time to time. I do take boron. That came up earlier. I do take I think it's I have to look on my chart.
3 milligrams.
I think it's 2 to 4 is what I wrote down. Yeah.
Okay.
2 to 4. Yeah. 2 to 4. And I'm happy to send over my list. Although basically everything we talked about here, it's covered. I mean, I take some K2 on your recommendation, and
awesome.
I noticed that my cardiac markers got better. So
cool.
Thank you. I take some garlic extract. I sometimes take some CLA, sometimes take some green tea extract. But I think those are not absolute. But the K2 was a very good recommendation, because my blood lipid profiles are really good, but they weren't quite exactly where I wanted them to put the K2 in, and everything just kind of locked into place. So thank you.
What happened to your HDL after introducing TRT? Because from what I've seen, the main significant aberrations in biomarkers after the deployment of exogenous tests in general is like, it's not that deleterious to, especially at TRT dosages, you're not going to have some crazy, like maybe some outliers are going to have potential viscosity issues in their hematology that they need to address through lifestyle changes or whatever. But in general, the thing I see most problematic or difficult to deal with is HDL suppression. And I guess sometimes SHBG suppression can be an issue for some people, where they get into but usually those individuals are using too high of a dose and infrequent of a dosing schedule. But the HDL, just interested if you notice any differences.
Yeah. So an answer, and then I also have a question for you. So it's interesting. My LDL HDL ratios and my my HDL actually improved, but I attribute that to I started running more. So one of the things that I noticed before starting TRT was that I would train, and then it was very hard to train a day or two later. I was kind of bragging and aches and pains and things, and you still get them, but I'm able to train more. So rather than just just train more in the gym, what I decided to do was, at this point it's very basic. It's like weight train, take a day off, and on that day off do some sort of cardiovascular work. I consider the cardiovascular work days off, but that points to how I gym versus running. To me, running is one of those things where I feel like the only reason to stop running is because you decide to stop running, whereas moving physical weight is actually a physics thing, as opposed to a neural motivation limited thing. So it's just alternating, lift, run, lift, run, lift, run. And then every once in a while, typically after training legs with weights, I take a day off from everything, because I don't typically want to run the day after I've done that, if I've done it properly. So I added more running and was able to recover, that's what I think led to the improvement in HDL. So this is an interesting twist, and I think it's an important one perhaps to mention, which is that yes, TRT can cause some issues with lipid profiles, but if it allows you to do more of the health promoting things that are going to support your lipid profiles, that can actually feed back to a better situation overall. And that's what happened to me. Likewise, the loss of any appetite for sugar or bad foods or processed foods, complete zero appetite for them. So overall, everything improves.
No, that's incredible. Yeah, that's great.
So that's how it worked for me. And then that's why I loathe to hear that people start taking TRT or maybe even abusing these things, and then they use that as an excuse to be looser with their training and their diet, then of course they're going to get sicker, right?
Yeah.
It's just, it stands to reason, the question I had though was, in your vast experience, because you certainly know for yourself and you've seen a lot of data from a lot of folks, what is the optimal free T range?
2 to 3% of your total, and then your total dictated by it kind of depends, because some people, they're so infrequent with their administration that trough versus peak has such a big disparity that they're basically functioning on super physiological territory for like a couple days, and then they dip down into like this down slope where they go from like, I don't know, 1300 all the way down to like 500, and then they take their next shot and they go back up. So they get like super physiological amounts of aromatization, 5-alpha reduction, but proportionally the like what would be representative of like healthy endogenous like androgen balance, and like SHBG is ultimately the regulating protein of what is going to determine like how androgen dominant you are versus like everything else. That 2 to 3% is like generally seen as like you're in the good zone, but that could be arbitrary based on just like, the data. It doesn't mean that you have to be there. But if I was to see, like, let's just say hypothetically you're injecting frequently and your total T is 800 total, I would want to see something like, if you were to ask me for just like in general, what would you want to see as my free? I would want to see something like a 20 upwards of like at most a 24, 25. And that would be like representative of like endogenous, like well-balanced hormones. Now, sometimes this can be a bit different in individuals because very few individuals are even administering on an every other day basis like you are, which is like considered very frequent by normal person standards. They're doing like once a week, or even worse, once every 2 weeks or something like that. Those individuals in general are going to crash the SHBG so significantly that they end up with like a 4 or 5% free T relative to their total. And then they end up in that sympathetically driven dominant state, perpetual like heightened androgenic signaling. Because again, that free T is what's like circulating around and like being super psychoactive in your brain, right? So that sort of thing is what can lead to that kind of like overly anxious, harder to fall asleep. You actually end up being a little bit more volatile and aggressive, whereas otherwise at a more frequent schedule or lower dosage burden, you might otherwise be totally fine and like non-volatile, that sort of thing. So
interesting. That's very useful. I mean, first person to ever put a number around this, and to as a reference point. I realize that it's a flexible reference point, but that's very helpful. I was just curious. Something that there isn't a lot. I've scoured the literature for a kind of optimal ratio, but
hey, what's your total now anyway? Because if you're at baseline like 600, 700 with natural, like did you push up to like 1200 presumably, or like 1000 to 1200 or something?
Yeah, so I'm waiting to get some new blood work back, but yeah, so when I switched to the every third day, it went it was up in the 12 okay. range. So it wasn't on the far end, but then I switched to this every other day regimen, and I'm still waiting to get blood work done based on that. But subjectively just feel much better.
Yeah. I think the kind of like trade-off in like nuisance versus like optimizing the regimen, like obviously if you could replicate endogenous like pulsation, that would be great, because that would be representative of like what you would naturally do if you had, but no one's going to pin every single day. But I think every other day is kind of like the disparity and like the benefit to the nuisance of it. It's so minute between every day and every other day that's kind of like, I think the golden spot for people to kind of like try and get the regimen down to is like the frequency getting down to like an every other day schedule using like an insulin pen. So it's like very well tolerated, not creating a lot of scar tissue. It's very like, doesn't feel super invasive because you're not using 1.5 inch harpoon that you'd otherwise need to use if you pinned once a week with a much higher volume of oil. Like that sort of thing, I think is like it seems like you're pretty dialed in. I wouldn't be surprised if you see like a 1000 on your next one, you feel like it seems like it's representative of like you feel pretty good now. So that's great to hear.
Yeah, that would be a great place to be. And as I'm tracking all this, of course, because I'm doing this in large part to eventually just, reveal all the details of this on numbers and subjectively too. I've taken notes. I'll take mental notes, et cetera, just because there's so little information out there on this. I mean, I think, you are one of the major sources of information out there in terms of someone who's, thinking about this in a balanced way. Everyone else has to guess. But thanks to you, and a few other rare individuals out there like Kyle who are talking about this in the clinical sense and in the practical sense, there's now a real wealth of information under your umbrella.
Just a disclaimer to everyone too. We're not saying that if you take 30 milligrams every other day, you'll end up with a 1200 or a 1000, because some people might need more, some people might need less. So ultimately it's like individually dependent too. So this is again, the importance of the longitudinal data and getting your own blood work done. But just wanted to put that out there just in case people don't clue in. But I guess
that they don't cut a clip and then adjust that statement and then create something.
Yeah, I'm sure that probably happens to you sometimes. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, from time to time. What's interesting is but I think in general, yes, it does happen from time to time. But in general, I think people, it's great to see that people are sharing their experiences with different health tools, good and bad. When again, like 5% of people or so will experience some serious gastric distress with magnesium of any kind. Well, those people shouldn't take magnesium. The other 95%, it's up to them. So I would say that the best dosage for some people is 0 milligrams of anything. And 0 is a valid number to take for some people. That's important too.
I appreciate you staying on with me until 10:15. Like, I know for me, this isn't bedtime, but for you, it's like pretty damn close. So I appreciate you taking the time to help educate and put out high quality information and create hopefully some high quality entertainment for people simultaneously. And I've been looking forward to this for a while. I'm glad to finally have you on here. And if you want to plug any of your social medias, is it Huberman Lab on all the platforms or?
Yeah, okay. Huberman Lab on Instagram, Huberman Lab on Twitter. It's mostly Instagram where I'm at. And then Huberman Lab podcast is Apple, Spotify. We have a YouTube channel as well. So it's any of those formats. And I also want to thank you. I stayed on because I was really enjoying the conversation. As I know I've said it a number of times throughout, but I think that to be able to access quality information and to really, for people to also learn some biology, they're learning from you about hormone pathways and thinking about how these things interact. It's really wonderful. I look forward to hopefully more conversations on and offline with you and to discuss the papers that we're pulling up. I think what we've established a sort of informal journal club of sorts. For those that don't know, journal clubs are where people interested in a common topic will start to review papers and think about those papers and discuss them. And I just really, I really want to extend my genuine thanks because I think that it's rare to get the opportunity to drill really deep into all these topics, and to also get a chance to learn back and forth about what people are doing, what they should avoid doing, and it's just really terrific that you've created a platform for this. So thank you, Derek.
No, I appreciate that, man. So everyone go follow Andrew on his platforms, and as well watch out for a exclusive episode in the somewhat near future with our medical director at Marek Health, who's going to be featured on Andrew's podcast and deep diving even more into endocrinology and hormone optimization and whatnot. So watch out for that and make sure you like the video, subscribe, and catch you guys next time.